Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The skeletons were dancing. Their bleached appendages clacked and scraped together in a jumble of ulnas and tibias. They moved gracefully, inasmuch as skeletons could move at all, in perfect synchronicity. Harold Freeman stared at them in open-mouthed astonishment, a vague recollection of his schoolboy days dancing around the corners of his memory. There are 206 bones in the human body, 270 at birth. That is until the extra bones fuse into the final number of 206. Harold, write this down, please. Harold had never been much of an academic, but that random fact from Sister Mary Bernard's third-grade science class lingered in his mind as he watched the animated bones glide across the polished floor. This had to be some dark dream, a wispy figment of his excellent dinner come back to torment him. Harold was an elegant man of large appetites, the author of his destiny who believed that moderation was for imbeciles. The way he saw it, you were either a victim or a predator, and Harold had no desire to be someone else's lunch. He dined on the weak of mind, a first-class con man and thief, dealing mainly with the old and infirm. The force of his larger-than-life personality always drew them into his various schemes and elaborate plans. That last old bird had given him $52,000, the entirety of her life savings for his once-in-a-lifetime land deal, before shuffling off this mortal coil. Although she was helped along to paradise by a healthy regimen of poisoned herbal tea served with tiny little finger sandwiches by none other than Harold himself. No one was ever the wiser. They never were. He had lost count of how many had met a similar fate, preferring not to dwell on the unpleasantness of his chosen occupation. He had a refined palate, voraciously inhaling life's pleasures where and when he found them, and needed a healthy income to keep them coming. Food was always the first item on his list, followed by a taste for fine wines. At 6'5" and tipping the scales at a hearty 377 pounds, Harold barreled through life, eating up every second he possibly could. He wondered darkly if his skeleton would dance on its own, buried as it was in layers upon layers of Harold, itching to shed him like a fleshy cocoon. He was so engrossed with the skeletal couple that he failed to take in the music that served as the backdrop for their ghoulish swaying. He chastised himself for the oversight. Harold was also quite the connoisseur of music, the classical pieces of yore tickling his fancy. He'd played the French horn in his school orchestra and could always pick out its melancholy, haunting sound in any performance. His ears perked up as he closed his eyes, feeling the crest and swell of the music. When he opened them again, he rubbed at his sockets furiously, not wanting to believe what he was seeing was even remotely possible. An entire demented orchestra loomed before him, rotting, decaying corpses with instruments that appeared to be made of bone, muscle, and gore. The conductor was something ripped from the pages of a Gothic novel, his left eye dangling down his desiccated face, wild brittle hair framing the continents that would have been welcome at the very gates of hell. Over 7 feet tall, with his tuxedo moldering off of his half-rotted frame, the conductor held a large, razor-sharp femur bone in his right hand while keeping tempo with his left. He was very passionate about the music as pieces of him flew off in every direction, plopping softly onto the floor. Harold knew that he had heard this music before, was trying to identify it as he also gazed in disbelief upon the orchestra. They ranged from skeletal to fresh and every stage in between. The violinists were raw and angrily red, splashes of blood and carnage flying in their wake as they sawed away at the strings of sinew. The flutists were delicate, mummified creatures, which Harold found endlessly amusing, for every flute player he had ever met in his band-playing days was precisely that way in real life. Their brittle fingers worked upon the keys, and he wondered how they could blow so well into their flutes without a lip or nose to be found in the entire section. He noticed that the trumpet players were a thing of macabre beauty. Black as pitch, they appeared burned and disfigured. Hunks of charred flesh oozed off of their faces as they played, smoke billowing from red-hot instruments. Harold experienced a moment of ghoulish fancy, imagining the entire brass section engulfed in flames. There were many occasions when he'd wished fire and brimstone upon trumpeters, for they were a notoriously arrogant lot. The rumbling of percussionists briefly caught his attention. A Lovecraftian vision. Enormous slug-like apparitions with countless eyes were gripping their mallets and slimy tentacles, pounding away in a fury. In between movements, they would reach out in their horrific grasp and snatch away pieces from the half-decayed woodwind players seated directly in front of them. Harold watched in disgust as one of the supernatural slugs gobbled down a mangled ear, slurping and smacking away in gruesome ecstasy without ever missing a beat. The skeletons doubled back again, surprisingly nimble on fossilized feet, as the waltz played on and on behind them. Harold had a moment of clarity, finally placing the name of the piece. Of course, it was Wiener Blut, the Viennese Blood Waltz by Johann Strauss II. We played this many times in my orchestra. I should have recognized it immediately. In a display of pure fancy, Harold closed his eyes and began to move along with the hypnotic music. For such a portly man, he was incredibly light on his feet, twirling around the floor amongst the ghastly ensemble. The waltz moved along to its stirring conclusion, a timpani drum roll with the entire brass section that Harold was itching to play again. He hadn't touched the French horn in years, but somehow, he knew that he could do it, picking right up where he left off. Faster and faster, he spun, 1, 2, 3, waltzing his imaginary partner around the floor as the skeleton struggled to keep pace with him. He was free, filled with glorious abandon as the music carried him along. As the very last notes washed over him, Harold paused and noted an empty chair in the brass section, exactly where he used to sit all those years ago. An enormous, blood-red French horn sat on the chair, glistening in bits of gore and huge wriggling worms. One of the tiny creatures managed to extricate itself and began climbing up the player's leg in the next chair. Harold took in that his fellow horn player appeared to be half skeletonized already, the worms doing their work all too well. Pieces of flesh still lingered upon him or her. Harold had no idea, except for a complete scent of pulsating lungs that inflated and deflated like a balloon. It finished the final movement and gently placed the bell down on its non-existent lap, turning to Harold expectantly. He could hear the last notes of the piece still floating through the air, the hellish orchestra observing him, awaiting his reaction. The skeleton dancer stopped moving and stood completely still in anticipation. Harold began to applaud. Always one to give credit where credit is due, even in the most distressing of situations. At first tentatively, and then with gusto. He cheered their efforts, for it truly was a masterful performance. The conductor turned and took a final bow, his red eyes piercing Harold with malevolence. "Bravo! Bravo!" he said over and over as they basked in his admiration. The conductor stepped down off the dais and came face to face with him, close enough for Harold to detect an earthy, rotten smell with just a faint hint of sulfur. Harold could see, hidden in his unruly thatch of hair, something he hadn't noticed before. Suddenly, everything clicked into place as he finally identified the knotted horns on the conductor's horrific head. Harold had a sudden vision of a restaurant. An entire Chateaubriand all to himself, with an impeccable bottle of full-bodied 1985 Médoc Rouge. He raised a toast high into the air to celebrate the death of his latest Marc, followed by sudden eye-watering chest pain. After that, everything was a blur. Or was it? Harold quickly took stock of his life and knew that his prospects at the moment were greatly diminished, to say the very least. He had only the briefest of moments to ponder his many sins before the conductor lashed out with his femur shiv and sliced cleanly through Harold's windpipe before raising the bloody bone high into the air. Hell's orchestra rushed forward and slowly began to tear Harold apart. It took them quite an age, for there was a lot of Harold to digest. They fell upon him in waves, feeding by each instrumental section until the entirety of the ballroom was covered in blood and discarded offal. The flutes and oboes each daintily gnawed upon a limb, paring them down to the bone quite nicely in seconds as the bassoonists and trombones started in on Harold's ponderous stomach. The string section went in to liberate his well-worn liver, while the slimy percussionists looped his large intestines around and around their hideous forms like shiny pink coats. The remainder of the string and brass sections fought over the scraps. And Harold thought it only appropriate, since they were constantly jockeying for position within any ensemble. Their grim task nearly at an end, the worms were unleashed to do their duty as they pruned Harold's considerable form down to the bone, leaving only his lungs untouched and in their proper place. He was grateful that he had never smoked a day in his life, for his lungs appeared pink and full, ready to play for eternity. The orchestra moved back into position as the skeleton dancers considered this updated version of Harold, unencumbered by gobs and gobs of extra flesh. They held out their hands to him as he rose from the floor, reborn into his true self at long last. He carefully made his way over to his new chair on bony feet, swaying wildly as he found his balance. He joined the dancers as they moved across the floor and back to their starting point. Harold picked up his new French horn, the worms falling to the ground as he lifted it to his freshly made skull and got into ready position. The conductor tapped his grisly baton onto his music stand, then raised it high into the air, signaling that they were ready to begin once again. They would play the Blood Waltz. The creature that had once been Harold Freeman knew that it would always be the Blood Waltz. On and on in an eternal loop, as the orchestra played and the skeletons danced around them. As he took his rightful spot in the ensemble and began to play, Harold could feel the first pangs of a gnawing, insatiable hunger as Hell's orchestra anxiously awaited its next inductee. Harold might not dine well this night, but he knew that he would never dine alone again.
The sleeping mind fascinates me, namely the nighttime hallucinations we call dreams. Because of this, I keep a journal to record every thought that passes through my brain at night. I set at least one alarm each day so that I'm able to wake up during my REM cycles and recall my grandest dreams. Sometimes I fall back asleep, but for the most part, I keep up with it. It's been an enlightening experience, and so far, I've filled a dozen notebooks with my nightly adventures. In addition to cataloging my dreams, I study the phenomenon. I've dissected every sleep guide at my disposal and watched countless documentaries. I even took an elective back in high school called Nocturnal Fantasies, though it only lasted one semester. Not enough students shared my affinity for the topic. In other words, most of my waking life is consumed by sleep in one form or another. Craving more knowledge on the subject, I recently pursued my town library's massive local authors section. I was hoping to find a book on dreams I hadn't read, as this was the one part of the library I'd yet to set foot in. It was a long shot, but one I was willing to take in the name of research. After fishing through a plethora of self-published romance novels, I happened across one non-fiction title that caught my eye: Sleep Tactics, Exercises for a Mind at Rest, written by Jack Grovewood. The blurb on the back was vague and reminiscent of a self-help book with quotes like, "Learn the secrets to a good night's rest," and "Feed your mind's insatiable appetite for better understanding." Not a book of dreams per se, but it did pique my interest. Delving into the book at home, I found it to be more up my alley than I previously expected. It was filled with chapters pertaining to lucid dreaming, meditation, and even sleepwalking. I was already familiar with most of the content, but it turned out to be an enjoyable read. It wasn't until the last chapter, though, that I was caught completely off guard. I will outline most of it below. Chapter 16. How to Exit Your Body. Disclaimer: this is not an OBE, or out-of-body experience. As stated in Chapter 8, out of body, out of bed, I do believe in OBEs, but I find that they're just another form of dreaming. What I'm about to divulge to you is something completely different. It's neither an OBE nor any dream state. This is a way to truly exit your body using sleep paralysis as the catalyst. Before I discuss specifics, I'd like to go over a few prerequisites. To pull this off, you must be proficient at lucid dreaming. What I mean by this is that you need to have lucid dreams regularly and retain lucidity for longer periods of time in these dreams. It also helps if you're able to manipulate your dream environment with ease. If you only lucid dream on occasion, you'll have to train your mind to do so more often. See Chapter 6, Becoming a Lucid Lucy. If you, however, are unable to lucid dream, then this technique is not for you. It's nothing personal. You simply lack the tools needed for departure. Another requirement is sleep paralysis. Most of us have experienced this at one time or another, but it will help immensely if you're experiencing it on a regular basis. Coupled with lucidity and a focused mind, sleep paralysis is the only way out of your own skin, so to speak. That's all you need in the way of mental capabilities, more or less. It's an added bonus if you've had an OBE or wake-initiated lucid dream. See Chapter 7, Wake Unto Sleep. Now on to the fun part. I'm going to lay this out in a step-by-step fashion, followed by a more detailed explanation of what to expect upon achieving your first departure. Keep in mind that results may vary. Step 1. Fall asleep on your back in a slanted position. It could be on a recliner or a car seat, but your body must be diagonal relative to the ground. That's the only way I've ever been able to get this to work. For one reason or another, gravity plays a role. Step 2. Attain sleep paralysis. This is more of a waiting game than a step, as it's not entirely possible to execute at will. When it does happen, lucidity is key. You must be aware that you're in a state of deep sleep paralysis and be unafraid of your lack of mobility. This is one of the ways being a lucid dreamer comes in handy. Step 3. Once paralyzed, attempt to move your legs. If you're in the proper position, at least one of them should be mobile. If you can't move either leg, then you'll have to restart and experiment by tilting your seat in different positions. Step 4. Upon freeing one or more of your legs, attempt to free your arms. They will feel incredibly stiff, and you shouldn't be able to move them, try as you might. You should then feel a sharp sting on your head. Don't be alarmed, you're not having an aneurysm. This is completely normal and is necessary to make your exit. Step 5. As difficult and strenuous as it may be, keep trying to free your arms. As you do this, attempt to move the rest of your body as well. Put everything you have into fighting the paralysis. Just don't fall back asleep. Step 6. As you wrestle with your mind and body, the stinging sensation in your brain is going to grow. It won't be painful, but it will cause you great discomfort. Let it happen. As the sensation builds, you'll start to feel yourself drift away from your body. Don't fight it. Your mind is like a rubber band and will want to bounce back from where it's being stretched. Don't let it. Follow the flow of departure. If you steal your mind's focus and follow these instructions to a T, you will have successfully exited your earthly meat sack and unlocked a marvel of the mind that has only just begun to be understood. And that's the gist of it. The author went on to say that the world you find yourself in upon departure will harbor some differences to the one you started in. It will appear similar in almost every way, but will be completely void of any life forms. On top of that, nothing will budge. Everything will remain in its place, as still as can be. After revealing the delicate process of re-entering one's body, the author ended the chapter with an eerie warning. Whatever you do, don't go near the water. I was dumbfounded. The entire book up to that point was factual, but what that last chapter seemed like was something out of a science fiction novel. It certainly made for good entertainment, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Why have such an out-of-place pseudoscience chapter in an otherwise reputable book? It just didn't make any sense. About a week passed before I thought about the book again. It was almost time to return it to the library, so I decided to reread its final chapter. As absurd as it seemed, I teetered between laughing it off once and for all and actually giving it a shot. It did meet all of the requirements, and it would amuse me to some small extent. I could, at the very least, say I tried it for myself, if for no other reason than to prove it was a load of crap. After weighing the pros and cons, I ended up giving in to my curiosity. I knew it wasn't going to work, but it would be fun, a little experiment, if nothing else. Besides, was there really anything better for me to do during an episode of sleep paralysis? The only minor nuisance was that I'd have to sleep on one of my recliners instead of in a big, comfy, king-size Serta mattress. My small price to pay for the sake of scientific discovery, I suppose. On the night in question, I wound up having 3 episodes of sleep paralysis. During the first, I was far too groggy. I completely forgot about the book and quickly fell back asleep. The second one lasted a bit longer, and I was able to remember the steps outlined in the last chapter. I could just barely move one of my legs, and upon trying my arms, I did feel a small but noticeable discomfort in my head. I wondered, for a split second, if the author was onto something, and that made me a bit excited. Because of this, I jolted awake. Reflecting on the incident, I became intrigued. I still didn't believe that I could exit my body, but I knew something was going on. I decided to tilt the recliner back a bit and try again. This time I would have better control. The next episode came pretty quick. I hadn't fallen asleep yet, but my body was getting ready to. That's it, I thought. I allowed the paralysis to fully set in before attempting anything. It was difficult not to fall asleep, but I managed. This time around, I was able to gain full control over my left leg. I moved it back and forth a few times before trying to free my arms. True to the method, they wouldn't budge and felt oddly stiff, more so than usual. This is when the familiar sting set in. It jarred me, but I kept going. The more I tried to move my arms, the greater the sting grew. Believe it or not, as I continued, I did, in fact, feel myself drifting away from my body. I tried to keep it up, but my nerves got the best of me. I lost all control for just a moment and was sucked right back into my body, immediately waking up in the process. The experience startled the hell out of me. It was beginning to seem more and more likely that the last chapter of Jack Grovewood's book was somehow accurate. My curiosity became aroused to such an extent that I felt the overwhelming need to tell somebody about it. Luckily, I knew just the person. My buddy Josh is a character. He believes in a lot of what I don't. This causes us to butt heads on a lot of topics. In simple terms, I'm a skeptic and he's a believer. One thing we can agree on, however, is our love for dreams. He's the only person I can talk to at length about the subject. He also happens to meet the requirements listed in the book. I was hoping he would join me for a sleep session and help me get to the bottom of what was going on. I called Josh up and told him everything. He was ecstatic, as I knew he would be, and agreed to meet me at my place the following night for departure. In his mind, this was going to go off without a hitch. I wasn't completely sold on it yet. I was just happy to have someone else to tag along for the ride. Fast forward to the following night. We hung out for a bit, and I showed Josh the book. His eyes grew wide upon reading the final chapter, and he couldn't wait to try it out himself. I told him not to get his hopes up, but it was clear to me that they already were. Ready as ever, we lay down at opposite ends of the living room on my two recliners. Josh cracked a joke about how this was the first night we'd be sleeping together. I threw a pillow at him and then we're off. Shut-eye was just around the corner. This was when things took a turn for the bizarre. I didn't have an episode of sleep paralysis right away, but I did end up waking a few hours into my nap. I noticed that Josh was fast asleep in the recliner across the room. Needing to empty my bladder, I walked past him to get to the bathroom, tripping over his legs in the process. I met the floor with a thud and turned around to see if Josh had woken. To my surprise, he hadn't. I knew he was a heavy sleeper, but even he should have woken up given the commotion. Becoming worried, I called out his name. No reaction. I tried shaking him. Nothing. I grabbed a wrist and checked his pulse. It was there, however weak. This was when I panicked. I ran to my room, grabbed my phone, and scrambled to hit the call button. Just as I was about to dial 911, I heard a loud gasp from the next room, like a diver coming up for air. I ran out there as fast as I could, and to my delight, Josh was awake. He looked up at me with wide eyes and said, "Dude, it fucking worked." I was flabbergasted. Though Josh was an over-enthusiastic believer and downright stubborn at times, he was no liar. I asked him more than once if he was sure it wasn't a dream, and he insisted that he was absolutely certain. Between his firm conviction and weak pulse just moments before, I had no choice but to believe him. It seemed that the book was legitimate after all. We spent the next couple of hours talking about it. After leaving his body, Josh found himself in my living room, but it was noticeably inanimate. Everything was perfectly still, not even a speck of dust floating through the air. Josh also noticed that his body was translucent, a milky white outline of its former shape. He attempted to open the door to my house, but the knob wouldn't turn and the door would not budge. It took him a while to realize this, but he found that his new form allowed him to phase through walls. Josh went on to tell me that the world outside was very different from ours. He said it was like having the contrast dialed up on a picture. That and the static nature of everything made it feel like being trapped in a photograph. I tried to imagine it, but I knew I needed to see it for myself. We made plans to go back to sleep and enter the world together. Despite my excitement, I was able to make my first successful departure that night. Josh was waiting in the room for me, next to his sleeping body. Seeing ourselves like that was fascinating in and of itself, but I wanted more than anything to see the world outside, a world where adventure and discovery awaited us. For a few weeks, Josh slept over at my house, and we discovered the new world. It was fun and downright addicting. Curiosity was what kept us going, and we wanted to know more and more about the odd realm we had discovered. Here are just a few of the things we learned during our excursions. The lighting is fixed. It always looks to be about noontime, though there's no sun in the sky. It's impossible to phase through older buildings, not really sure why. There are no life forms, just as the book stated, not even animals or insects. Sound is reverbed. There's always a slight echo when Josh and I talk. It is possible to fall asleep there, but you won't dream. If you travel too far from your body, you'll hit an invisible wall and be unable to go any further. Time doesn't pass in the real world while you're departed. After about a month of successful departures, things changed. The more we explored, the more uncomfortable I felt. It always seemed like something was watching us, even though there was no one around. Josh was the opposite. Our late-night adventures were becoming so routine for him that he was becoming bored. He kept talking about water and how he wanted to get a closer look at the pond near the main road. I reminded Josh of the author's warning, but it didn't seem to faze him. Eventually, his curiosity got the best of him. One night, upon leaving my body, Josh was nowhere to be found. I thought that maybe he hadn't departed yet, but up to that point, he had always beaten me to the punch. This could only mean one thing. I phased through the walls of my home and raced to the nearby pond. Josh was there, standing at the end of the dock that locals used for fishing in the real world. I yelled out to them, "Josh, what are you doing?" "It's fine. See? There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just water." I watched as Josh reached down and touched the surface of the pond. It rippled. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The water should not have reacted. We'd been there for weeks and hadn't seen a single thing move. Even the air was still. Perplexed, I began walking out toward Josh. He lifted his hand up, just as awestruck as I was. As he pulled his arm back, the ripple expanded. With it, a small portion of the water turned dark. After a few moments, something reached out from the blackness. It was a hand. A fucking hand. It reached up, grabbed Josh's leg, yanking him downward. He went feet first into the water, holding onto the dock for dear life. As he screamed, I ran toward him. Before I could even get halfway to the position, I watched him disappear into the water. I ran the rest of the way, but the darkness had faded and returned to normal. My best friend was gone. In a state of fear-induced panic, I ran away. I wanted to save Josh, but I didn't know how. Plus, I felt that if I re-entered my body, perhaps I'd find him, awake in the real world. It was wishful thinking, but it was all I had. That wishful thinking fell flat when I woke. Josh was still unconscious. I tried and tried, but I could not wake him. Eventually, I called 911, and he was taken away on a stretcher. The doctors say he's in a coma but can't discern what caused it. And that's everything. I'm a fucking wreck over what happened. I've tried visiting Josh in the hospital, but I can't face his parents, and they're always there. Instead, I go out to the pond in the real world, hoping that somehow I'll find answers. All I do end up finding are more questions. They keep me up at night, along with a recurring nightmare replaying the events from that day. I've tried departing since, but to no avail. Something's holding me back. It might be fear. That world is like a photograph, a still frame of a place we were never meant to see. A moment frozen in time with a layer of reality stripped away, and something is living there. Despite this truth, I feel a need to dive back in and save my friend. He didn't heed the author's warning, but I'm the reason he entered the world in the first place. I'm the reason he can't wake up. I have to go back.
The rank aroma of something rotted, like maggot-infested roadkill underneath the blistering summer sun, slams into his nostrils. No, it smells like the spoiled packages of hamburger he discovered in the refrigerator after his mother's death. He waves his arms to dissipate the odor before leaning over to lift the window pane for fresh air. It is stuck from years of numerous coats of paint and neglect. Bending down, he turns on the small fan, pissed when nothing happens. Maybe a rat crawled inside the walls and died? Did the unwanted visitor chew through the wires too? Siri, remind me to call an exterminator in the morning. No response. He tries again and gets the same result before realizing the phone is dead and plugs it into the closest outlet. Time for an upgrade. Battery life is pathetic on these older models. Good thing I've got plenty of cash to spend on things now. Thanks, Mother, for emptying your bank account and stashing all the money inside the house. Makes things simpler and nothing to report to the IRS. Glancing at his watch, he blinks twice. Irked, it has stopped working. He looks back over at the laptop. Confusion swirls inside his overtired brain. How does 7 hours vanish without his awareness of the passing of time? A growling stomach reminds him he hasn't eaten since breakfast. Did he miss the food delivery driver while immersed in writing? Siri, check status of order from Instacart. Again, dead silence. The screen remains black despite being plugged in. Why is it not charging? The overhead lights are on and the rumble of the heating system filters through the thin walls, so there's power. Mental and physical exhaustion coupled with hunger bears down on his body, blocking the creative section of the mind and obliterating any chances of conjuring cohesive thoughts, much less a readable sentence. The exorbitant price paid for the high-oxygen permeability contacts designed specifically for people with dry eyes and astigmatism was a waste of money because they are stuck to a set of sore, gritty corneas while he stared for hours without blinking at the monitor while non-existent people spewed out their experiences and thoughts through his fingers. Eager to move to another room and away from the rank stench, he snatches up the laptop and energy drink on the desk, entering the living room. He sips the last dribbles of the tepid liquid while situating himself on the couch, scanning the document on the screen titled Death Arrives on Black Wings by George Rayburn, and scowls. Garbage. Absolute drivel. Boring rhetoric composed of dated plot lines and regurgitated tropes. None of this is frightening on any level. A complete waste of my time and energy. I thought rattling around inside this freaking dump would help me unleash a genuine piece of horror. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Damn. The doorbell chimes, giving him pause before hitting the delete button. After minimizing the screen, he rises, the dilapidated wood floors creaking underneath his heavy footsteps while walking through the small intertwining rooms until arriving at the front door. Dust and dirt flitter in his wake, but he does not care. Beams of moonlight filter through the windows, casting shimmering rays across the panes and shabby curtains. For a split second, it looks like wraiths swaying in a macabre dance dressed in dingy white. When alive, his mother's housekeeping skills were abysmal, and he inherited Patrice Nanette Rayburn's aversion to cleaning. Besides, it would be a waste of time to clean and declutter, since he plans on selling the shithole once it serves the purpose of inspiring the horror novel. He cannot wait to get out of Little Rock and back to Pensacola. He opens the door, flicks on the light, and scans the ramshackle porch, searching for the delivery box of food. A crow squawks to his left. No, not a crow. A raven. A huge black thing with hints of blue, long skinny legs and thick talons, perched on the railing. He waves his arms and the creature flaps its wings, disappearing into the shadowy night. George jumps when noticing a slender elderly man to his right, standing inches away with a strange vapid look on his wrinkled face, a grocery bag clasped in his hands. Shit! I didn't see you. Are you the delivery man? Good evening, Mr. Rayburn. Pardon me for startling you, and no, I'm not. I'm your neighbor. George looks past the geezer and out toward the street. Did you see a package in the driveway? I'm expecting a grocery delivery. No packages, I'm afraid. This old neighborhood is in a bad part of town, and porch pirates are in full swing this year. Your mother had deliveries stolen all the time. Damn economy. If it's any consolation, I brought beer and snacks. Staring at the man, who is at least 2 inches taller than his own 6'2" frame, George sighs. He considers feigning a headache, yet the lure of free booze and something to fill his hungry belly overrides the irritation stemming from the impromptu visit. What kind of beer? If it's a bland domestic, you've wasted a trip. Cackling laughter, full of thick phlegm, assails his ears when the man steps inside. He has a weird halting gait as he carefully picks his steps, missing the spots that creak. Tonight's a special occasion, so I sprung for dark IPA, toasted pita chips, and walnuts. George grimaces. Old dude stink. A disgusting combination of mothballs and personal body odor wafts behind him as he makes his way toward the stuffy, sparsely decorated living room. Furrowing his brow at the audacity he just waltzed inside uninvited, he tamps down his rising temper. What are we celebrating? Your newfound windfall in life trajectory, remember? Actually, I don't. We've never met. Understandable. A grieving mind takes time to reset itself, so it is no wonder you don't recall our interaction at the funeral. Name's Chester Griffin. You said to come by any time and we'd swap stories about Ms. Patrice. God rest her soul. You know, crack some cold ones while you pick my brain about recollections of her time as my neighbor and your decision to stay on for a short time while writing a book. George searches his memories for conversing with the man but draws a blank. A weird sensation flutters throughout his chest. He remembers thinking those things inside his head at the funeral while playing the part of dutiful morning son, but not speaking them out loud. He ignores the sensation, attributing the confusion to hunger and lack of sleep. Dark, heavy beer, pita chips, and walnuts are his favorite. I'm not one to turn down free beer, especially an IPA, so why not? Maybe I'll have better luck writing when slightly buzzed and my grumbling guts are full. I was just reviewing what I've written so far, and it is awful. Chester groans while easing down onto the faded floral print couch. His knees crackle and pop, and the sound makes George's skin crawl. Dust flutters in his wake, yet he appears oblivious. I like my beer in a frozen mug. Do you have one? A mug, yes. Frozen, no. The fridge is in on its last legs and the freezer quit working last week. I'll set out the snacks if you'd be so kind as to fetch the mug. I find it uncouth to drink beer straight from the bottle. Stifling the urge to roll his eyes, George nods once before heading to the kitchen, returning in seconds with a semi-clean mug. Here you go, sir. Please, call me Chester. Only if you call me George. Hiding the disgust from his expression as Chester's gnarled, dirty fingers latch around the glass, he steps over and picks up the laptop, closes it, and sets it on the small end table before reaching for a bottle. Ah, nice. This brand's the best. Chester fills the mug to the rim and the weird, vapid look returns before he takes a sip. I agree. Ms. Patrice mentioned it was her favorite as well. She certainly would have enjoyed sharing one with you before the cancer ate her insides away. Taken aback by the rude comment, George bites his lip, holding in a snarky comeback. Before the evening turns sour, he grabs a handful of walnuts and tosses them into his mouth, immediately spitting them out. Oh my, I'm sorry. I swore Ms. Patrice told me walnuts were your favorite. Perhaps I misunderstood. Near the end of her time on this plane of existence, she had trouble speaking coherent sentences because of the multiple surgeries, chemotherapy, and radiation treatments to remove the tumors in her esophagus, mouth, and tongue. George's anger peaks. He doesn't need to be reminded his mother died a slow, agonizing death from esophageal carcinoma, or the fact he did not come to visit her during her last 3 months alive. Walnuts are my favorite, but something's wrong with these. They taste like moldy old dirt. Really? Chester leans forward, scoops up several in his claw-like fingers, tosses them into his mouth, frowns, yet swallows them. Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Such a shame and waste. I'll return them to the grocer and request a refund. I am so embarrassed. To remove the rancid taste, George twists off the cap and downs half the bottle. The glorious brew does its job, washing the last vestiges of curdled, perhaps rotted, walnuts from his mouth. Chester's watery brown eyes watch his every move before cutting over to the laptop. The vapid look vanishes, replaced by a curious gleam and a tinge of superiority. I saw the medical van earlier this week, removing all her hospice equipment from the living area. Did you donate her clothes and sundry items as well? Nosy bastard. Yes, the company took her clothing and toiletries, promising they would go to someone in need of such things. How thoughtful of you. Chester picks at the pita chips, crunching loudly on two. Have you decided what to do with the house? It needs extensive cosmetic repair, but it has good bones. Of course, it also sits smack dab in the middle of an area people are fleeing from rather than moving to, so getting a decent price may prove problematic. At least there is no mortgage, so whatever you sell it for will be pure profit. I accompanied Ms. Patrice to the clerk's office several months ago when she recorded the beneficiary deed. Smart woman. Saved you from having to endure the probate process. Aha! Light bulb alert. This is the real reason he came to visit. You want to buy it, don't you? Cheap, since you know it's not mortgaged. I can assure you, I have zero interest in spending funds I do not have on something I do not need, so no. Just making pleasant conversation, that's all. For your children or grandchildren, then? George presses. Nice enough thoughts, but I never married nor sired offspring. I believe we've established I am not interested in the residence, so let's move on. Tell me why you believe the horror story is lackluster. I never mentioned it was a horror story. George's eyebrows furrow. Were you spying on me earlier? No, it was simply an educated guess. You don't appear the type who writes action or romance or science fiction or westerns. Horror suits you. Taking another long pull from the bottle until swallowing the last droplet, George remains quiet, contemplating whether that was a backhanded compliment or an indirect jab at his manhood. He concludes it was a mixture of both. He grabs another beer. Perhaps I can help you create something truly scary? I have been a fan of the genre for as long as I can remember. George takes several hefty gulps, savoring the heavy malt that deliciously combines toasted caramel with hints of coffee and chocolate. The annoyance at the old man's intrusive visit and comments wanes. maybe bouncing ideas off another person would be helpful. I think the biggest hurdle I'm facing is crafting something unique. You know, a fresh take on fright. I see how that can be quite a conundrum. Over the past centuries, what triggers horror, revulsion, and terror in the human psyche has certainly changed, especially with the creation of visual media. The days of writers exploring taboo societal issues or natural phenomenon to evoke fear through beautifully penned yet spine-tingling literary fiction are gone. Now what passes as literature and so-called entertainment offerings comprise of thrown-together boring tropes full of nothing but blood, gore, and outright snuff porn, profiting off the immense pain and torture of humans. Each new work tries to outdo the previous drivel by kicking up the disgust meter. But what gets lost in each new iteration is the art of telling a story. There is, however, a glimmer of hope about the new direction of the genre. What's that? There is no reason for the gratuitous bloodshed and violence. No theme or plot line. No reason is the plot line. Interesting perspectives. H.P. Lovecraft said the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown, but I believe the problem is twofold. Mankind understands things previously unknown, and we have been desensitized to violence thrust upon us through various mediums, and therefore, fear is irrelevant. Perhaps that is true on some levels, but historians are fond of saying genuine horror must contain a sense of evil able to be truly menacing, life-destroying, and antithetical to happiness. You are correct. With the advancement of knowledge, mankind understands the allegorical themes presented in the classical tales, but that does not negate the fact the world is still full of terrifying occurrences not fully comprehensible or controllable. Death, war, disease, poverty, natural disasters, cruel fate, maniacal dictators in control of weaponry capable of eradicating humanity come to mind. Entranced by the old man's insight, George tests a pita chip, realizes it is fine, downs a mouthful, swallows, and smiles. Very interesting. Boring tropes, that's one of my hurdles. All my research about crafting a story produced the same advice. Write what you know, and apparently, I know nothing about horror other than what I've been subjected to over the years, so I'm just regurgitating the works of others, which makes me a hack. Allow me to guess which boring trope you fell prey to. Sure. Let's see. The comatose soul wakes up only to discover they are trapped inside an apocalyptic disaster. A creepy child with uncanny otherworldly abilities whom everyone fears. The mutant human or humanoid driven by kill lust, impervious to weapons. Evil dolls capable of talking or tainted amulets or cursed trinkets. The possessive significant other who stalks without ceasing, destroying the thing he or she loved just so another cannot have them. A misunderstood scientist trying to explain the unexplainable to the masses who refuse to listen or heed his warnings and die from their lack of belief. No, I do not believe those were your chosen portal to extract a tale. You either opted for a soul-damning haunting from the spirits of the recently departed, or went with the nerd and promiscuous or weird girl who either dies from their lack of brain power or during sexual activity, or uses their skills to survive whatever horror lurks in the dark woods. Stunned by the old man's words and how on target they are, George chuckles. Option 2 is the one. The handsome yet slightly quirky virgin gamer nerd finally gets the hot promiscuous girl out on a date, and they find themselves on the run from a serial killer. Yes, you are correct. That plotline has been done ad nauseum. Chester removes a cigar and lighter from his shirt pocket. Do you mind? Do you? George nods toward a pack of Marlboro Reds on the table. Not at all. Sometimes ingesting nicotine gets the creative juices flowing. Look at us, still partaking in the same habit that ended Mrs. Patrice's life. It appears we are both believers in the adage, "It won't happen to me." Guess so. Both men light up, each enjoying their respective vices in silence. Considering your athletic physique, I am surprised a strong male overpowering you and disrupting amorous intentions in the woods before taking your life and the life of your lover frightens you. I was leaning toward a good old-fashioned ghost story. George opens another beer while laughing, slightly surprised he's enjoying the conversation. Write what you know, remember? Like all other imaginary monsters, I do not believe in ghosts, nor have I encountered one, so I have nothing to draw from. The serial killer in the woods is plausible and was the first thing that came to mind. I'm a gamer, but I've never had any trouble with finding women to bed, so the fiction part is the nerdy male virgin finally going on a date. Yet, you are still coming up short in the creativity department. Perhaps you need to focus on what scares you? George rises and tosses 2 logs into the dirty, soot-filled fireplace before grabbing an old newspaper from the enormous pile left by his hoarder mother. He flicks the lighter and watches the yellow and orange flames lick across the dry wood. That's the other hurdle I cannot seem to jump. Nothing scares me. Chester lets out an incredulous gasp. Come now, George. If you want to be an artist, you must confront painful truths about yourself before expecting others to find your creative endeavors believable no matter the genre, but particularly horror. Fear is deeply interwoven into the human psyche, necessary for survival of all species, a primitive, ingrained response meant to defend against danger. Are you not afraid of what lies beyond, if anything at all? Will we cease to exist once inside the dark grave as the earth reclaims our flesh? Is death truly the end? If the law of conservation of mass is correct, and matter can be neither created nor destroyed, only capable of changing form, will we be aware of the change? And exactly what will we change into? Is there a life force inside us? A soul, if you will, that continues outside of the mortal body? Those questions were your sweet mother's greatest fears, facing the unknown, alone. No one is impervious to fear. Sorry to disappoint you. You appeared frightened when you noticed me standing on the porch. Jump scares don't count. They are instinctual actions by the body when surprised. In entertainment mediums, they are used to engage the audience and elicit a heightened sense of connection to the victim before they die. Nothing more, nothing less. I'm not impervious to fear. As you mentioned earlier, fear is an inborn genetic trait and all life possesses a form of it, but I am unimpressed by it. I already know monsters, alien ghosts, goblins, witches, vampires, werewolves, all other fictional ilk do not exist and are not lurking in the shadows, waiting to shred me to pieces and feast upon my organs while I scream in agony. I am fully aware the world isn't a safe place and death is inevitable, so why fear circumstances out of my control? Nothing I partake of or abstain from, eat, ingest, how fast I drive, how many vitamins or magic youth elixirs I gobble down will gain me 1 extra minute when my allotted time ends, whether from the ravages of time on the flesh, by the hand of another, disease, car accident, natural disaster, or hell, even by suicide. Benjamin Franklin said death and taxes are the only certainties in life, and I agree with him. So my motto is simple. Live my best life by sucking every drop of tantalizing juice from the tree of life until it runs dry. Nice speech and interesting theories, but I do not believe you. George finds the response humorous for some weird reason. Why? Chester's features harden, making his skin appear like marble. If you fear nothing, Why did you allow your mother to suffer alone without being here by her side when she needed the comfort of her only child the most? That was a rhetorical question. Ms. Patrice provided the answer. You feared the emotions watching her die would evoke and being confronted with your own mortality. You were too scared to see the monster cancer, the surgeries, and the treatment turned her into. George bursts out laughing. Wow! If that's what she told you, she was way off base. The flames in the fireplace dwindle and disappear as frigid, rank air pumps out of the vents. The shabby curtains flutter in response. George curses under his breath. He'll have to shell out some of his inheritance to replace the busted heater before listing the property and contact an exterminator. Obviously, whatever vermin died isn't inside the walls. It's trapped in the ductwork. Chester clears his throat. So, what was your reason for leaving Ms. Patrice to grapple alone with the ravages of cancer and her impending death? Rising to his feet, noticing he is a bit unsteady, George grabs another beer. No reason, I just didn't. That is a bold-faced lie. The shift in tone and demeanor caused George to glance over at the old man. He looks paler, thinner, and more fragile than when he sat down, maybe because of the sudden temperature drop. Why do you care whether I had a reason or not? Wait, did you two have something going on besides being just neighbors? Is this your weird way of trying to make me feel bad for letting the cold-hearted woman who never wanted a child or all the responsibilities motherhood entails die alone? Is that what this little visit is all about? We did not have an intimate relationship. I do, however, know the intimate details of her life, including her personal struggles. But no, I am not here to shame you. After downing the entire bottle, George locks gazes with the annoying geezer. Then why are you here? I already told you, to discuss your newfound windfall and life trajectory, which is what we are doing. Currently, I'm offering my expensive knowledge to assist you in crafting a truly horrifying tale. No, that was just a ruse to segue over to shaming me. I'm impervious to that emotion, thanks to a woman who never showed me affection, never offered an encouraging word, wasn't concerned about providing food on the table, a birthday card, Christmas present, or cared about anyone except herself and the countless men she brought home. I lied earlier. I did have a reason for staying away. I fucking hated her and wanted her to suffer, alone, just like she did to me when I was little. Had I shown up, I wouldn't have been able to stop laughing at her expense. The only reason I'm here now is to take possession of the money and house, which I consider a small down payment of what she owed me for all the pain and suffering she inflicted on me. Thanks for the beer and chips. The walnuts, not so much. Time to call it a night, Chester. A car horn blares outside, followed in seconds by the chime of the doorbell. Chester doesn't appear to notice. He's too focused on staring at George, face devoid of any discernible emotion. Ah, there's the Instacart delivery, and your cue to exit without this evening getting any weirder. George bumped into the wall twice on his way to the front door. Several beers downed in quick succession on an empty stomach messed with his equilibrium. He opens the door and snatches the 2 bags off the porch. Turning left, he heads toward the kitchen and calls over his shoulder. Lock the door behind you. No response. Salivating like a Pavlov dog at the contents, he sets the bags on the counter, grabs the bread and sandwich meat, rolls it up, and shoves half into his mouth. His throat and tongue feel thick, and his stomach does a weird flip-flop a millisecond before burning pain radiates from his neck, shooting daggers straight into his brain. The intensity makes his entire body tremble and knees buckle while choking. Spitting it out, he gapes at the hunk of partially chewed food on the floor. Several gray maggots wriggle and squirm in between the chunks of bread and meat. The disgusting sight makes him projectile vomit all over the stained linoleum. Shaking and unsteady on his feet, he makes his way to the living room since he hasn't heard a sound, which means Chester is still in the house. The last thing he needs is for the old bastard to see him weak or ill, which he would probably enjoy. I wasn't kidding when I said the night's over. Time to go. His voice sounds odd, gravelly, as though speaking with a mouthful of rocks. Rounding the corner into the room, he stops short. What the fuck? Chester stands next to the hearth, but he's no longer wearing the outfit he had on before, and his head is inches away from the ceiling. A long ebony robe made from what looks like feathers covers his entire body, and a weird glow surrounds his face, making the exposed skin appear translucent. The edges of the robe flutter like wings, drawing George's attention. The old man's feet aren't touching the ground. Fury burns through George's brain. What kind of hallucinogen did you give me? It was in the walnuts, wasn't it? I knew they tasted weird. Wait, you ate them too. So that means you put something in the ductwork. Is that why it smelled so bad earlier? I bet that's it. And you were spying on me, and that's how you knew what I was writing. When I come off this trip, I'm going to tear you apart, you low-life scum-sucking piece of shit. You did have a thing with Patrice, didn't you? Is that the reason you came here tonight? You wanted to make me pay for not being here for her? Did she ask you to torment me after her death? Without making a sound, Chester glides over, eyes no longer watery brown. Now they are vibrant, glowing sable. If you desire a reason, I'm here to usher in your reckoning, since the tantalizing juice from your tree of life is dry. The second the words reach George's ears, his body is shoved forward until inches away from the large mirror above the fireplace. The horrendous stench from before envelops his entire being. In the reflection is his mother's destroyed face staring at him from black, lifeless eyes. Her once thick honey-colored hair is matted, skin mottled and sunken in the spots where the tumors were removed. The mouth opens and her tongue and teeth are missing from inside the putrid hole. I have the answers now, my son. We do not cease to exist once inside the dark grave as the earth reclaims our flesh. Death is only the beginning. Matter can be neither created nor destroyed, only capable of changing form. And I am aware of the excruciating change. There is a life force inside us that continues outside of the mortal body and pays for our mistakes in one plane of existence while trapped in another, forever. The image shifts, and now it is his face staring back, yet the damage remains. He is almost unrecognizable. The pain from earlier when in the kitchen reignites, sending sharp, deep pangs throughout his body. He tries to move away from the foulness, but is frozen in place. Suddenly, Chester is behind him, enveloping his body in the confines of the feathery robe. Tears pour down George's cheeks while recalling the title of his story. Death arrives on black wings. Oh shit. He isn't Mom's neighbor. He isn't human. I'm not hallucinating, nor have I been drugged. This is really happening. Foul hot breath grazes his ears. Chester whispers, Did I succeed in creating something truly scary? George nods through his tears, mentally willing himself to fight off whatever drug courses through his veins. Good. Time to take you to the next level. Petrified. With a loud whoosh of the robe, George is racked with debilitating pain, sorrow, grief, remorse, and fear as he watches his body collapse onto the floor, dead before the head smashes onto the edge of the fireplace. Loud, phlegmy cackles surround him as he is transported on black wings to what he truly does fear. What awaits him on the next plane of existence.
I was awaiting an interview with a dying man, sitting in an uncomfortable chair, watching an ancient television set mounted high in the corner of the hospital waiting room that flashed riot scenes. Placards waving, black faces crying into cameras. The Capitol was burning, and youths running in the night with bandanas covering their faces as tear gas canisters spiraled out from police guns and bounced along the concrete. History was happening, yet I was assigned a pointless interview to go nowhere, to fill space in a local newspaper for people who are so dead themselves they didn't realize the printed word was deceased. Gone. Perhaps I could do a think piece about the latest race riot in the Capitol, but there wouldn't be much to think about in a small white town that remained an untouched, disinterested minor gear in the strange gyre that turned society. $50 an article for a master's degree in English. The world had gone to shit, and, from the scenes flashing across the television, it appeared to be diving further into chaos. Walter J. Cook's organs were shutting down one by one. An old girlfriend once told me that when she was in nursing school, the professor asked the class what caused 100% of all death. It seemed a trick question, but it wasn't. The answer was quite simple. Cardiac failure. No matter what causes it, the heart stopping is the ultimate direct cause. Everything else is just details. It seemed Cook would find that out soon enough. Death was for the old as far as I was concerned. I was young. I wanted the action, the chaos of life. I wanted to be covering the riots, the politics of the day, but everyone has to pay their dues and work their way up. And that's what I was doing that dark night. Walter J. Cook was a former town councilman who served on the town board for 2 uneventful decades as first selectman before retiring with a small pension and a touch of dementia. Cook had backed out of his driveway into the lane of a speeding van, which T-boned his old Buick and flipped the car onto its roof. Cook had sustained internal damage from the seatbelt jolting against his soft organs, and while he was awake and able to talk, though often quite nonsensically, the doctor said his body was essentially shutting down, and the waitlist for organ transplants far too long for any hope of recovery. My editor wanted a final interview with a man who had long been a town institution. Cook had no family that I could cross-reference with, or with whom I could write up their fond memories, so I was left with the last will and testament of what appeared to be the least interesting man on Earth, and it was quite possibly insane at this point. I had seen pictures of Walter J. Cook before, bony shoulders and a sunken chest, with a belly that popped out just over the belt of his chinos, shirt always tucked in, and clothes always neatly pressed, and cared for as only elderly men who have retired, or whose children have grown and moved away, could wear. He grew up during a time when men wouldn't be caught dead in public in anything less than pressed clothes, nice socks, and decent shoes. Toward the end of his tenure as first selectman, in his old age, his skin retained a tightness in the face that was a testament to clean living and a knowledge that the world had once been a better place. That was what I thought while perusing through pictures of Cook in the Palastair Registers database. He had been well liked during his tenure, oversaw the construction of an entire new sports park, complete with basketball and tennis courts, soccer and baseball fields, and a playground for the children. He had kept Palastair relatively undeveloped, and that was the way people liked it. He would make appearances at the town parades and cookouts, and he smiled with full, well-cared-for teeth, and a certain pained look in his eyes. It seemed an awareness of something other, which I took to probably be the result of his time in Vietnam while serving in the army. But now Cook's appearance was shocking. He had withered down to virtually nothing, his body so light and brittle as to be lifted off the hospital bed by a small child. The air was static and smelled of rot and shit camouflaged with bleach. Plastic tubes and saline bags and cheap-looking medical computers that probably cost small fortunes wound their way into his veins so that he appeared merely the withering human facade of some mass-manufactured machine. Cook's eyes watched the small television in his room, the same news reports I had been viewing in the waiting room. His eyes didn't move, but he whispered, "So, you've come." "This man is here from the Palace Star Register, Mr. Cook," the nurse said. "He wants to talk to you so everyone in town can see how you're doing. I want you to be nice to him, okay?" His head turned slightly, regarded her with disdain, and I saw the flash of something ugly. Something that rests in the dark depths of men, that wiggles its way out when all the vestiges of civilized life have been wrested from them. It was, in a word, hatred. She whispered to me, "He's not all there. He can be mean, say some disturbing things, hallucinate, or think you're someone else." I nodded, and Cook whispered inaudibly from what little breath was left in his lungs. "What's that, Mr. Cook?" I leaned closer to him and listened for the rasps of his ancient vocal cords. They came back with a haunting whisper. "I have so many things to tell you." I don't know how to write what I heard that evening, or what I heard over my follow-up interviews, which I have never dreamed I would conduct before that night. Even to this day, winding my way through his rambling, virulent, and inchoate stories seems to be a maze too complicated for me to solve. I can tell you what I did write for the Palace Star Register the following week, after the veil of my former life had been so painfully lifted. Former First Selectman considers whole town family. A nice, happy, tight little piece with a quick synopsis of Walter Cook's long life, from birth in Missouri to his time as councilman. But that was entirely made up. I pieced together the short biography I had learned of him during my research, and made the nice title from his listing of several town council members over and over when I asked if he had any family left. But I couldn't write the truth. I couldn't write what he actually had to say. I couldn't write about what he kept referring to as the Immortal Coil. Every question I asked him seemed to lead into a darkness so insane that half of me thought it was pure hallucination, and the other half suspected that reality was far worse than any film or novel. Recording, June 6, 2015, 7:25 p.m. Can you tell me about your experience in the military during the Vietnam War, Mr. Cook? And how you've seen the world change from that time? Vietnam was the beginning, boy. Vietnam was where it all began. That's what I've been trying to tell the nurses here. That's where I met Major Kurtz. I had enlisted out of high school, but I was smart, see? During our basic training, a man came. We all suspected him as part of the CIA, and administered to us a written questionnaire that we were to all fill out as completely and honestly as possible. It wasn't like anything else in the Army. You're always filling out questionnaires, but none of them had been like this. It asked us bizarre questions, largely of a religious nature, asking us if we had ever used LSD or seen unexplained things in the sky. It asked about dreams and nightmares and family histories of insanity. Then, after the written part, we were each taken to a room and hooked up to monitoring devices like a lie detector. And then we were shown pictures of dead children and other horrid things, and they gauged our reaction to them. It was all an examination to see if we were capable. Capable for what? Operation White Star, of course. What was Operation White Star? Even though I enlisted as a grunt, they pulled me into an office and offered me a position in a covert operation set up in Laos, with an officers' group being run by the Special Forces. See, officially, the point of our work there was to teach the Laosians how to fight off the North Vietnamese. It was run by the CIA even before the war began, started in 1961, I think. And it was called Operation White Star. Oh, I was out of my league with these guys. They needed a few of us grunts, but they needed ones with intelligence. Open minds, they said, for some of their reconnaissance work. It was better pay, more guerrilla-style combat rather than just getting shot in the ass guarding a boat dock. I was flown into Laos on an unmarked chopper, low to the trees where Charlie could take pot shots at us as we flew over. We touched down in a small village just over the Vietnamese line. The place looked empty, and when the pilot killed the engine, it was dead silent. You've never been in the jungle, I'm sure, but it's never dead silent. Not unless something dangerous is about. Then all the birds and monkeys and creatures shut their yaps and go into hiding. Well, this place was dead silent. The huts were empty. There were no villagers or soldiers. Nothing. But the pilot acted like this was all part of the routine. He led me up to a patch of land, an area that had been cleared out of the jungle. He told me to drop my stuff and just wait there. I said, "Wait for what, to get shot?" "Just shut your mouth and wait," he told me. Then he walked off back to the chopper, fired her up and took off. Just like that. And I was alone, standing in this clearing, just waiting to be killed. I waited for hours, you see. Hours I waited, and finally, right at dusk, this man, an American man, comes walking out of the jungle like he'd been sitting there watching me the entire time. And he just stares at me. He's wearing fatigues, but with no markings, no patches, nothing. He looks at me and says, "You can stay here alone or you can come with me. But if you come with me, there's no turning back. It's full commitment, not just for the war, but for life. Do you understand?" I always thought there was a dirty trick to play, but that's how they operate. Dirty tricks. Choices that aren't really choices. And then you're in over your head. So I said, yes. I didn't want to be left out there by myself. I couldn't walk to the nearest camp. I was in the middle of nowhere. He told me to leave my stuff and follow him. He led me up a long trail to the top of a mountain. It was night by the time we reached the top, and the jungle was pitch black. But we came to this clearing, and there were all these people, 50 or so villagers on their knees bowing to a Buddhist shrine that was made out of wood and copper. Really a beautiful piece of religious art. And there were all the rest of the soldiers, probably 20 of them, myself included. There were 2 large fires burning and one villager tied up inside the Buddhist shrine, gagged and wrapped around a stake. Major Kurtz, 'cause that's who it was that led me up there, took a torch from one of the fires and handed it to me. And he said, "Go burn it down." I said, "What? What do you mean?" And then he screamed at me like some kind of demon. And he said, "Burn it down!" The villagers were still all on their knees with their heads bowed, and the other soldiers were looking at me like they were likely to shoot me where I stood. "Light this gook up, or so help me you will take his place," Kurtz told me. I did it. I'm not proud of it, but I understand it now. It was part of the initiation. Something that has to be done, a price has to be paid. You have to leave everything behind and become an empty vessel. Everything you thought about, right and wrong, love and honor. Everything that we were taught throughout our childhood must be sacrificed. You see, there are two paths in life. The right-hand path and the left-hand path. The left hand is the opposite. It is anathema to everything that we have been taught is right. And that is what White Star was. It was the left-hand path. It wasn't just war or soldiers. It was religious. It was a belief system that knew no bounds. I lit the man in that shrine on fire that night. And it changed my life, you understand. Kurtz was not just the platoon leader or some CIA spook, no. He was a religious leader. He was a prophet. He was brilliant. The entire North Vietnamese army was terrified of him, of us. He took whatever he wanted and the government was only too happy to give it as long as they didn't have to look with their eyes. He performed rites in that jungle at night that, oh, to this day I still can't put into words. It was a beautiful horror. They brand you, you see, but not on your skin. They brand your mind, your very soul, with the immortal coil. Are you smiling, Mr. Cook? Oh, you are so young and dumb. That's why I asked for you. The brilliant naivete of those who think they know the world. Excuse me? Oh, don't be offended, it's not your fault. The entire world is populated by nothing more than a bunch of carbon copies of people like yourself. Take a look up at that television screen there. You see those people out in the streets rioting? You see those reporters with their shirts and ties and dramatic looks on their faces? It is all an act on a gigantic stage. It is all a veil on which we show movie pictures to entertain your young, delusional minds. Even your universities, your scholars, your politicians are all actors in a play that they don't even know exists. And they play their parts well. All of them puppets. I think this is enough, Mr. Cook. I'm sure the people of this town will be horrified to hear what you've told me tonight. I hope you're just delusional, but I can guarantee you that I will be looking into this offensive and barbaric story of yours. You won't tell them. No, you won't. You want to be a big shot. You want to be a great reporter someday. You watch. You listen to me. You asked me how the world has changed since my time in the war. It has changed, but only because we made it change. So you run back to your little life and write your bogus story for the goddamn Palastair Register. It'll mean nothing and go nowhere. The ravings of a dying, demented old man. I've been telling the nurses here all kinds of stories this past week. No one will believe a word of what you say. But if you do want to be a reporter, if you do want the big scoop, you keep your eyes on the television. You come back in 2 days, when Dallas is burning over a Baptist minister being shot by some young skinhead brigade, and then you come back here and tell me that I've offended you. You go back and do your little research project. And then come back here and tell me what you found out. You go, little boy. Nurse! Nurse! They're coming for me! Nurse! End recording. How does one write something like that? Is it responsible to print the ravings of a dying man who is quite possibly delusional in his death throes? My editor, Bob Haskins, was pushing me for the piece the next day, but I didn't have it. I need more time, I told him, but really I needed to digest it, run it through my mind, figure out what, if anything, I was going to write. Bob, did Mr. Cook request me specifically to come talk to him? A funny look. No. I requested you, and I'm requesting you to get that piece written right quick. It's a little more difficult than that, Bob. He's not exactly telling me things that we want to print. Yeah, well, senility's a bitch. I did a little digging, but only came up with hints and possibilities. Cook hadn't been completely off his rocker. There was an Operation White Star that operated in Laos in the early 60s. It had been covert but ended at the outbreak of war in 1965 and was supposedly no longer operational when Walter Cook was in the military. I could find nothing on this mythical Major Kurtz. Nothing. But then everything as well. I would have to dig longer, and that would take more time. There had to be 1,000 people with that name that went through the military during the Vietnam era. Indeed, it seemed like every fourth soldier was named Kurtz or Cook. They popped up everywhere. Cambodia, covert missions into China, My Lai, Air America, Son Thang, and Ton Phong. A lot of ugliness seemed to carry those names. Men who appeared minor grunts, nameless and faceless American soldiers when considering an isolated incident, suddenly became a strange game of connect the dots between Kurtzes and Cooks across the Vietnam space-time continuum. Different men? The same? Nearly impossible. Walter J. It was exhausting. My eyes hurt, my brain burned. I thought of him laughing and smiling, recounting his weird story, and I contrasted that with images and impressions built up over reviewing his years on the town council, smiling in photographs, beloved member of the community. No wife, no kids, no relatives to speak of, no amassed wealth. He lived in a small 2-bedroom ranch situated in the middle of a grassy field near the edge of Pallistaire. His past seemed uniquely unremarkable until you listened to his stories. But then it wasn't his history that was so disturbing. Rather, it was his prophecy. Dallas burned, and my head spun, and there was the sudden sensation of a great and powerful veil being lifted by a deranged mind. The television screens were plastered with pundits and attorneys and police officials and politicians, all bickering between themselves, describing the gyre as it turned. Something, I could not say what, seemed to be tightening. But when is that just a personal feeling, and when is such a feeling evidenced and proven by reality? 2 days later, he said, and here it was on the television screen happening before my very eyes, and the nation was transfixed. Bob Haskins pushed my story deadline back to make room for AP articles about Dallas. I went back to the hospital and found Walter J. Cook looking somehow even more skeletal, his eyes piercing through orbital cavities. "Ah," he whispered. "And how is your article progressing?" Are you confronting the world with the real story of Walter J. Cook? We pushed your story back to make room for news that's actually important, I said. I threw my bedpan at a nurse today. Got my shit all over her shoes. Where would you like to begin? How about why you're telling this to me? He smiled. How did you know about Dallas? I said. Ask a better question, he said. Cook's house was a small single-story ranch situated in the middle of a sloping field whose crest dipped over a far hill. It was set back from a road that was barely wide enough to hold 2 cars passing in the night. This house was a bit of an enigma. Well, perhaps it was comfortable for a single man in his 70s. It seemed a lower class level than would be expected from a town selectman. The position paid well enough, nearly $80,000 a year. But Walter's house did not exude the kind of largesse that one would associate with someone making such wildly massive claims. Claims of pioneering the pornography industry from the sale of opium shipments running from Laos and Cambodia to the States. Wall Street investments in the 80s during the massive climb and divestment of Procter & Gamble before the poison gas leak in India. The claims of satanic conspiracy diluted through the 90s, run through with susceptible therapists, psychiatric quacks, and attention-starved women. Kurtz and Cook and their immortal Coil dipped long, devilish fingers into nearly every industry. They were spread like star constellations across the globe. What does all this have to do with Dallas? What do you know of Charlie Manson? He was a raving lunatic that killed a bunch of people and has a swastika tattoo on his forehead. That's just the beginning, he said. Kurt sent me to meet Charlie in July of '69, just before his great ascension. I could feel the power emanating off of him like heat from a black sun. Looking into his eyes was like looking into a doll's eyes. He was proof, evidence, that we were all merely puppets. He was evidence of the turns of the gyre, the forces that move like liquid through us all. There is no right. There is no wrong. There is just what is and what will be. I found Charles in a cave at the edge of the Mojave Desert, an arid, horrid place spotted with Joshua trees and rock outcroppings. I had followed the glow of firelight, and near dawn I had found them in a cave entrance, naked, fleshy, slithering over each other like a nest of snakes. Charles stood so close to me. He stared at me with those doll eyes. He took me by the hand and led me beyond the dull glow of firelight into the back reaches. The cave narrowed like a downward spiral, a coil into the earth, and on it was painted words of the coming war. Helter-skelter, swastikas and painted images of strange rites, pentagrams and stars of David. Then, 3 figures moved forward from the darkest reaches of the cave. I could barely make them out, but as they came into the light, I saw it was 3 women, fully nude but wearing the heads of animals. A buffalo, a goat, and a stag that had all been recently slaughtered and hollowed out, still with the stink of blood and meat. They walked to me and they took me by the hand. And I tell you, kid, I've never been so moved by a woman in my life. We laid down together and we fucked until I was nearly dead from dehydration. They never removed the animal heads, and I began to think of them as different creatures, mythical creatures, created from an amalgamation of man and animal, but with their dead eyes, their dull eyes. I cried out in ecstasy, and it echoed all through those cave walls down the coil of darkness. And I remember something strange sitting in the deepest reaches of that crypt. It was a man, I think, sitting cross-legged in the dark, watching us. And for some reason I knew deep down that he was pulling the strings of our intertwined arms and legs and cock and cunts. It was he, the great stage director of the puppet show. His eyes glowed, his teeth white as snow-capped mountains. He sat like an emaciated Buddha. I remember I wanted him. I wanted him so badly that I would do anything just to touch him. But he would not allow it. He kept pulling our strings till I was nearly dead, and the girls were bleeding between their legs. I never truly saw the puppet master. When I woke, there was nothing there, and Charles was once again dancing and singing in the firelight of the cave entrance, and his people were slithering together in the darkness, making strange noises and gestures and eating pills and mushrooms. I walked out of the cave and Charles stared at me once again with those massive, dull eyes. "Helter skelter," he said to me. "Again, what does this have to do with Dallas?" "Oh, that boy that shot down the preacher in Dallas. He had a tattoo, didn't he? The number 88 on the back of his head." "Of course he did." I popped the lock in the back door of Walter Cook's house and cracked the door jamb going through. Didn't matter. The old man would never be returning, and the house would probably be razed to make room for a modern colonial. The air was stale, unmoved for the past 2 weeks that Walter was in the hospital. It held that boring, unremarkable old man smell. Dust comprised of withering skin particles and mothballs. In that instant, I saw Walter J. Cook as a rather pathetic figure. For all his delusions of grandeur, his own Coil was proving more mortal by the second. Walter J. Cook lived a quiet life in the town of Pallistaire. Even when serving as first selectman, he was not known for entertaining house guests and was usually quite brief at social or town functions. But the man got things done, which led to his re-election several times over. People naturally assumed that he was just a bit shy, or a bit of a recluse, having never met the right woman. There were even rumors of him having never met the right man, and that his tiny house set in a field was his form of keeping things easy and simple, like a monk taking a vow of poverty and chastity. But the house looked as if it had never even been lived in. Everything was set up like a fully furnished rental that hadn't been touched in years, or a stage set from a 70s sitcom. The wallpaper and furniture seemed to move backward in time, and, in my mind, I could hear the echoing laugh track of the imaginary audience. But they were all laughing at me. I was the joke. I was the jester on a stage being laughed at by principalities of the real. I felt a strange sense of hate and anger standing in that tiny house, thinking of the things that Walter had told me. I was looking for that audience, searching under couches and in cabinets, hearing their laughter, and knowing that they were pointing at me and whispering to each other with hushed voices, almost embarrassed for me because I was too clueless to know any better. I knocked over lamps and smashed a mirror in an outburst of rage. There was a painful bloom in my stomach. The unfurling, or was it the uncoiling? of something long dormant but suddenly awakened, and sick with hunger. I tore into his rooms, ripped open beds, emptied drawers, kicked in closets, searching for something, anything that showed me. Showed me what? To this day, I am unsure. I broke sinks and tipped over the ancient television, broke pipes and upturned tables like some Midwestern teenager on a wilding. I was breathing hard and heavy, delirious, and not able to make sense of myself, much less this strange, totally unremarkable and boring place that I had just desecrated with chaos. A single door was locked beneath the stairway, a hiding place for the laughing audience. "You miserable fuck!" I said, and I kicked through the door. And, indeed, there was a sound of laughter when the stairway beneath the house was revealed through the kicked-in door. There was the smell of cold concrete, heavy with subterranean moisture. I hit a light switch, and there seemed an endless cascade of fluorescent lights kicking on that echoed in what sounded like a cavern. I took the steps slowly and cautiously to the bottom. The basement was the size of a football field, solid concrete painted a dull steel gray and seamless. The space was vast, so much larger than the house itself, extending up the hillside. It seemed a massive fallout shelter, but it was not stocked with food and supplies or anything of that sort. It was spare and sparse, and nearly empty except for the walls. They were adorned with massive canvases of symbols, completely stark, simple, and utilitarian. A red canvas with white circle and black swastika, four-sided pyramids with the all-seeing eye at their apex, the sigil of Baphomet, variations of crosses set in circles and misshapen spirals, black on white. 4 long glass cases were filled with what seemed to me artifacts both ancient and modern, like some kind of strange museum. Set in the middle of the wall of images were 3 massive statues, figures of men 10 feet tall, featureless, and made of pure metal. Their smooth contours stood with heads slightly bowed, as if in contemplation or, perhaps, looking down on humanity. Their presence caused an anxiety in me that I had never felt before. I almost turned and ran from their gaze, as if they would suddenly come to life and take me. To this day, I still see them standing there, watching. On the floor, massive and painted in black, the number 88 turned sideways and overlapped to form a double helix, like 2 symbols of infinity side by side, showing the DNA strand that guides all of life. And I suddenly began to realize the nature of the immortal Coil. At the far end of this massive basement museum was a single high-backed leather chair, set before a screen with an old film projector, strung up with 2 large coils of film. The fluorescent lights didn't extend this far, so it was in shadow. I feared someone was in the chair, but it was empty. I pawed at the projector. I flipped a switch, and the machine turned on with a burning light, and a square appeared on the screen as the film began to whirl over the projector. Images began to form, the pictures racing ever faster, forming movement, contrasts, faces, people, and then things. Things that I could never forget. Recording June 10th, 2015, 11:13 a.m. "The next place will be Oakland," he said. "But don't worry. Soon it will come for all of you. It has always been a war, and it comes to all of us sooner or later. What will happen in Oakland? It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that it will happen. And it will happen again and again and again, till it is over. What is the immortal coil? What does all of this have to do with it? You want simple answers, don't you? Not so bright, maybe. Wouldn't it be easy if I just told you everything like a TV show? I could. Maybe. But it wouldn't help you at all. You'd get locked up in the psych ward if you uttered a word of it to anyone else. No, I don't wish that on you. I just want you to carry it. To keep it going. I don't think you know me very well then, if you think that I would keep up your legacy. No. I'm not imparting to you some dying wish like a man passing the torch to his son. No. I'm spreading to you like a disease. A cancer that will eat away at you. You want to leave? You don't want to carry this illness? Really, it's too late, but you can leave now if you want. But we both know that you won't. Curiosity kills. It drives insane. It will spread from me to you to countless others. You will try to prevent it, but you will be incapable. For good or bad, the immortal coil will continue to wind tighter and tighter, and you will help it, like it or not, till there is the ultimate war. Helter-skelter, my boy. Just like Charles predicted. Never gonna happen, you crazy old fuck. Oh, you think not? It's already happening. Every day, every city, every news report, every person. I think your immortal coil is taking a little too much credit. You're making a kitten into a tiger. In 2002, I attended an unofficial conference of small-town mayors and first selectmen in Las Vegas. You can look that up if you like. It's in the town records. Quite an affair, I must say. All lights and booze and call girls running through the Bellagio with a withered and gray-haired old white man on each arm. Orgies going all through the night with Viagra and cocaine in candy bowls. The girls, they let us do whatever we wanted. I had never been the same since that night with Charlie in the desert, and so my tastes were quite different, I suppose. But those girls did not flinch once. They did not ask questions. I was able to, well, anyway, enough of that. It was quite an affair, to say the least. But the pinnacle of the conference was our observation of a great neonatal surgeon. We were transported by a series of buses out of the city limits into the desert, a trip which took several hours until we came to a large circular building in the middle of nowhere. It had a very low profile because most of it was underground. We were led down a spiral deeper and deeper under the earth, and then into a massive surgical theater. Everything dark but the bright white light in the center, and viewing screens above the lights so we could view the intricacies of the procedure. There was a man, the surgeon, who appeared quite older than any of us at the conference, but I tell you, there was never a steadier hand in all the world. He moved as if he were an animatronic prop with wrinkled human skin pulled over its pneumatic workings. There were 2 nurses with him. I never saw his face in full because of the mask, but I could see his eyes and his hands and his movements. And I tell you, that was enough to show me that this was no ordinary man. He was something else. But definitely to call him human would not be sufficient. The same with Kurtz, and that figure brooding in the back of Charlie's cave in the Mojave. He was something other. 2 police officers escorted a black girl into the center of the theater. She couldn't have been more than 20, and she was feisty, fighting them the whole time. But finally, they managed to get her on the table and strap her wrists and ankles down with leather straps. The surgeon injected her with a large needle, which caused her to calm down almost immediately. We could all see she was pregnant. Probably 6 months, I'd say, but I don't have an eye for these kinds of things. No experience, you understand. Then he began. She was put under anesthesia, and the surgeon took a scalpel to her protruding belly. He cut gently at first, and then harder, and the blood was allowed to spill on the floor, and it was collected in a shallow ring etched into the concrete that enclosed the surgical table. The 3 nurses stood at the background with the police officers, hands folded in front of their laps, stone still, like porcelain figurines. We watched closely on camera as the surgeon pulled back the thin layers of skin and muscle and fat, and then exposed the sleeping child in the mother's womb, shiny with membrane and pulsing umbilical cord. Then he cut into the child, a small incision at the base of its tiny skull. All the while, both mother and child slept under the gas, and we could see the blood pulsing between them. Then he delicately cut into the brain and removed a small piece from the child's brain stem. It was a quivering piece of pink and gray gelatin, no larger than the child's fingernail, but on the screen it was massive. Glorious. A true piece of the primordial life. The surgeon held it up for all of us to see, and we applauded him and his work. He placed the jellied life in a small container and handed it off to one of the nurses. The child and the girl were stitched up and returned to the streets from where they came. I believe she ended up in an insane asylum, babbling incoherently about what she had seen and been through. But oh, that was a glorious night. We painted the town red that night, as the old saying goes. But I tell you, oh, come now, where are you going? The nurse won't be by for my sponge bath for another hour. Wait. Wait. I've heard enough. I stumbled from the back door of Walter J. Cook's house and into the gray, dying dusk. I felt drunk or drugged. Everything spinning and whirling. The ground beneath me had shattered and I was plunging into the abyss. I walked into the field that ascended the hillside behind Cook's house, and it seemed so endless. I walked and stumbled through the tall grass, moving toward the strange horizon. I thought that I might just walk for eternity then, leaving everything behind, leaving the world behind. Images flashed through my mind like lightning flashes. Images from the old film reel. Images from my recent memory. Images of the future. I haven't even begun to tell you all the strange and mysterious wonders. You will never be the... Wait. What are you doing there, son? Oh, I see. You think this will somehow make it better. You think this will somehow save your soul. I'm already dying. What good will it do? It doesn't matter. But don't you see, son? Don't you see the position that you have been placed in now? Don't you see the decision that stands before you? There, at the crest of the hill, the gray horizon where the earth spills over into the dull evening sky, I saw them approach, as if rising up out of the earth itself. and I stopped and stood before them, helpless, reeling, and they looked down at me with their hideous countenance and raised their feminine arms to me while boring holes in my skull with their dull, animal eyes. "How do you think you'll get away with it, son? In this hospital full of people, with me hooked up to all these contraptions like some cyborg. All of them will scream bloody murder, and you'll never escape. I see the rage in your eyes, son. I know the feeling. I've been in your same position myself. Think of all the stories you could break, all the headlines you could garner with the full knowledge of the coming hardships. You want to be something more than a dumb, small-time reporter, don't you?" I could see their animal heads in the dying light, their gloriously feminine bodies reaching their hands out to me as if to take me beyond the hill crest, into the horizon. I could feel it, sense it. Just over the bend of earth, there was a dark force radiating just out of sight. A dull glow piercing the darkness that was nothing but rage and evil and cunning. The puppet master was dancing his strings as the vixens were calling for me to fall into their embrace. Which one, I wondered? Kurtz? Manson's demigod? The surgeon? Which one had tread this soil? Which one waited just over the ridge behind Walter J. Cook's house? Fine, son. That's the way you want it. Go for it. You are throwing your life away to hasten the death of a dying man. But you have your choice. You will make it soon enough. You can try to forget, but you never will. Everywhere you look, you will see the immortal Coil, and it will... End recording.
They limped painfully down the bank, and once the foremost of the two men staggered amongst the rough-strewn rocks. They were tired and weak, and their faces had the drawn expression of patience which comes of hardship long endured. They were heavily burdened with blanket packs which were strapped to their shoulders. Head straps passing across the forehead helped support these packs. Each man carried a rifle. They walked in the stoop posture, the shoulders well forward, the head still farther forward, the eyes bent upon the ground.
"I wish we had just about 2 of them cartridges that's laying in that cache of iron,"
said the second man. His voice was utterly and drearily expressionless. He spoke without enthusiasm, and the first man, limping into the milky stream that foamed over the rocks, vouchsafed no reply. The other man followed at his heels. They did not remove their footgear, though the water was icy cold. So cold that their ankles ached and their feet went numb. In places the water dashed against their knees, and both men staggered for footing. The man who followed slipped on the smooth boulder, nearly fell, but recovered himself with a violent effort. At the same time uttering a sharp exclamation of pain. He seemed faint and dizzy, and put out his free hand while he reeled, as though seeking support against the air. When he had steadied himself, he stepped forward, but reeled again and nearly fell. Then he stood still and looked at the other man, who had never turned his head. The man stood still for fully a minute, as though debating with himself. Then he called out, I say, Bill, I've sprained my ankle. Bill staggered on through the milky water. He did not look around. The man watched him go, and though his face was expressionless as ever, his eyes were like the eyes of a wounded deer. The other man limped up the farther bank and continued straight on without looking back. The man in the stream watched him. His lips trembled a little, so that the rough thatch of brown hair which covered them was visibly agitated. His tongue even strayed out to moisten them. Bill! He cried out. It was the pleading cry of a strong man in distress, but Bill's head did not turn. The man watched him go, limping grotesquely and lurching forward with the stammering gait up the slow slope toward the soft skyline of the low-lying hill. He watched the back of his gray fur coat till he passed over the crest and disappeared. Then he turned his gaze and slowly took in the circle of the world that remained to him now that Bill was gone. Near the horizon, the sun was smoldering dimly, almost obscured by formless mists and vapors, which gave an impression of mass and density without outline or tangibility. The man pulled out his watch, the while resting his weight on one leg. It was 4 o'clock. And as the season was near the last of July or 1st of August, he did not know the precise date within a week or two. He knew that the sun roughly marked the northwest. He looked to the south and knew that somewhere beyond those bleak hills lay the Great Bear Lake. Also, he knew that in that direction the Arctic Circle cut its forbidden way across the Canadian Barrens. This stream in which he stood was a feeder to the Coppermine River, which in turn flowed north and emptied into Coronation Gulf and the Arctic Ocean. He had never been there, but he had seen it once on a Hudson Bay Company chart. Again his gaze completed the circle of the world about him. It was not a heartening spectacle. Everywhere was soft skyline. The hills were all low-lying. There were no trees, no shrubs, no grasses. Naught but a tremendous and terrible desolation that sent fear swiftly dawning into his eyes.
Bill,
he whispered, once and twice.
Bill.
He cowered in the midst of the milky water, as though the vastness were pressing in upon him with overwhelming force, brutally crushing him with its complacent awfulness. He began to shake as with an ague fit till the gun fell from his hand with the splash. This served to rouse him. He fought with his fear and pulled himself together, groping in the water and recovering the weapon. He hitched his pack farther over on his left shoulder so as to take a portion of the weight from off the injured ankle. Then he proceeded slowly and carefully, wincing with pain, to the bank. He did not stop. With desperation that was madness, unmindful of the pain, he hurried up the slope to the crest of the hill over which his comrade had just disappeared. More grotesque and comical by far than that limp and jerking comrade. But at the crest, he saw a shallow valley, empty of life. He fought with his fear again, overcame it, hitched the pack still farther over his left shoulder, and lurched down the slope. The bottom of the valley was soggy with water, which the thick moss held sponge-like close to the surface. This water squirted out from under his feet at every step, and each time he lifted a foot, the action culminated in a sucking sound as the wet moss reluctantly released its grip. He picked his way from muskeg to muskeg, and followed the other man's footsteps along and across the rocky ledges, which thrust like eyelets through the sea of moss. Though alone, he was not lost. Farther on, he knew he would come to where dead spruce and fir bordered the shore of a little lake, the ctfdn, in the tongue of the country, the land of little sticks. and into that lake flowered a small stream, the water of which was not milky. There was rush grass on that stream. This he remembered well, but no timber, and he would follow it till its first trickle ceased at a divide. He would cross this divide in the first trickle of another stream, flowing to the west, which he would follow until it emptied into the River Dees. And here he would find the cache under an upturned canoe and piled over with many rocks. And in this cache would be ammunition for his empty gun, fish hooks and lines, a small net, all the utilities for the killing and snaring of food. Also, he would find flour, not much, a piece of bacon and some beans. Bill would be waiting for him there, and they would paddle away south down the Dees to the Great Bear Lake. And south across the lake they would go, ever south, till they gained the Mackenzie. And south, still south they would go, while the winter raced vainly after them, and the ice formed in the eddies, and the days grew chill and crisp. South to some warm Hudson Bay Company post, where timber grew tall and generous and there was grub without end. These were the thoughts of the man as he strove onward. But hard as he strove with his body, he strove equally hard with his mind, trying to think that Bill had not deserted him, that Bill would surely wait for him at the cache. He was compelled to think this thought, or else there would not be any use to strive, and he would have lain down and died. And as the dim ball of the sun sank slowly into the northwest, he covered every inch, and many times of his and Bill's flight south before the downcoming winter. And he conned the grub of the cache and the grub of the Hudson Bay Company post over and over again. He had not eaten for 2 days. For a far longer time he had not had all he wanted to eat. Often he stooped and picked pale muskeg berries, put them in his mouth, and chewed and swallowed them. A muskeg berry is a bit of a seed enclosed in a bit of water. In the mouth, the water melts away and the seed chews sharp and bitter. The man knew there was no nourishment in the berries, but he chewed them patiently, with a hope greater than knowledge and a fine experience. At 9 o'clock he stubbed his toe on a rocky ledge, and from sheer weariness and weakness staggered and fell. He lay for some time without movement on his side. Then he slipped out of the pack straps and clumsily dragged himself into a sitting posture. It was not yet dark, and in the lingering twilight he groped about among the rocks for shreds of dry moss. When he had gathered a heap, he built a fire, a smoldering, smudgy fire, and put a tin pot of water on to boil. He unwrapped his pack, and the first thing he did was to count his matches. There were 67. He counted them 3 times to make sure. He divided them into several portions, wrapping them in oil paper, disposing of one bunch in his empty tobacco pouch, of another bunch in the inside band of his battered hat, of a third bunch under his shirt on the chest. This accomplished, a panic came upon him, and he unwrapped them all and counted them again. There were still 67. He dried his wet foot gear by the fire. The moccasins were in soggy shreds. The blanket socks were torn through in places, and his feet were raw and bleeding. His ankle was throbbing, and he gave it an examination. It had swollen to the size of his knee. He tore a long strip from one of his 2 blankets and bound the ankle tightly. He tore other strips and bound them about his feet to serve for both moccasins and socks. Then he drank the pot of water, steaming hot, wound his watch, and crawled between his blankets. He slept like a dead man. The brief darkness around midnight came and went. The sun arose in the northeast. At least the day dawned in that quarter, for the sun was hidden by gray clouds. At 6 o'clock he awoke, quietly lying on his back. He gazed straight up into the gray sky and knew that he was hungry. As he rolled over on his elbow, he was startled by a loud snort and saw a bull caribou regarding him with alert curiosity. The animal was not more than 50 feet away, and instantly into the man's mind leaped the vision and the savor of a caribou steak sizzling and frying over a fire. Mechanically, he reached for the empty gun, drew a bead, and pulled the trigger. The bull snorted and leaped away, his hooves rattling and clattering as he fled across the ledges. The man cursed and flung the empty gun from him. He groaned aloud as he started to drag himself to his feet. It was a slow and arduous task. His joints were like rusty hinges. They worked harshly in their sockets, with much friction, and each bending or unbending was accomplished only through a sheer exertion of will. When he finally gained his feet, another minute or so was consumed in straightening up, so that he could stand erect as a man should stand. He crawled up a small knoll and surveyed the prospect. There were no trees, no bushes, nothing but a gray sea of moss, scarcely diversified by gray rocks, gray lakelets, and gray streamlets. The sky was gray. There was no sun, nor hint of sun. He had no idea of north, and he had forgotten the way he had come to this spot the night before. But he was not lost. He knew that. Soon he would come to the land of the little sticks. He felt that it lay off to the left somewhere not far, possibly just over the next low hill. He went back to put his pack into shape for traveling. He assured himself of the existence of his 3 separate parcels of matches, though he did not stop to count them. But he did linger, debating over a squat moose hide sack. It was not large. He could hide it under his 2 hands. He knew that it weighed 15 pounds, as much as all the rest of the pack, and it worried him. He finally set it to one side and proceeded to roll the pack. He paused to gaze at the squat moose hide sack. He picked it up hastily with a defiant glance about him, as though the desolation were trying to rob him of it. And when he rose to his feet to stagger on into the day, it was included in the pack on his back. He bore away to the left, stopping now and again to eat muskeg berries. His ankle had stiffened, his limp was more pronounced, but the pain of it was nothing compared with the pain of his stomach. The hunger pangs were sharp. They gnawed and gnawed until he could not keep his mind steady on the course he must pursue to gain the land of little sticks. The muskeg berries did not allay this gnawing, while they made his tongue and the roof of his mouth sore with their irritating bite. He came upon a valley where rock ptarmigans rose on whirring wings from the ledges and muskegs. He threw stones at them, but could not hit them. He placed his pack on the ground and stalked them as a cat stalks a sparrow. The sharp rocks cut through his pant legs till his knees left a trail of blood, but the hurt was lost in the hurt of his hunger. He squirmed over the wet moss, saturating his clothes and chilling his body, but he was not aware of it, so great was his fever for food. And always the ptarmigan rose, whirring before him, till their call became a mock to him, and he cursed them and cried aloud at them with their own cry. Once he crawled upon one that must have been asleep. He did not see it till it shot up in his face from its rocky nook. He made a clutch, as startled as was the rise of the ptarmigan, and there remained in his hand 3 tail feathers. As he watched its flight, he hated it, as though it had done him some terrible wrong. Then he returned and shouldered his pack. As the day wore along, he came into valleys or swells where game was more plentiful. A band of caribou passed by, 20-odd animals tantalizingly within rifle range. He felt a wild desire to run after them, a certitude that he could run them down. A black fox came toward him, carrying a ptarmigan in its mouth. The man shouted. It was a fearful cry, but the fox, leaping away in fright, did not drop the ptarmigan. Late in the afternoon, he followed the stream, milky with lime, which ran through sparse patches of rush grass. Grasping these rushes firmly near the root, he pulled up what resembled a young onion sprout no larger than a shingle nail. It was tender, and his teeth sank into it with a crunch that promised deliciously of food, but its fibers were tough. It was composed of stringy filaments saturated with water, like the berries, and devoid of nourishment. He threw off his pack and went into the rush grass on hands and knees, crunching and munching like some bovine creature. He was very weary and often wished to rest, to lie down and sleep, but he was continually driven on, not so much by his desire to gain the land of little sticks as by his hunger. He searched little ponds for frogs and dug up the earth with his nails for worms, though he knew in spite that neither frogs nor worms existed so far north. He looked into every pool of water vainly, until, as the long twilight came on, he discovered a solitary fish the size of a minnow in such a pool. He plunged his arm in up to the shoulder, but it eluded him. He reached for it with both hands and stirred up the milky mud at the bottom. In his excitement, he fell in, wetting himself to the waist. The water was too muddy to admit of his seeing a fish, and he was compelled to wait until the sediment had settled. The pursuit was renewed till the water was again muddied, but he could not wait. He unstrapped a tin bucket and began to beld the pool. He bailed wildly at first, splashing himself and flinging the water so short a distance that it ran back into the pool. He worked more carefully, striving to be cool, though his heart was pounding against his chest and his hands were trembling. At the end of half an hour, the pool was nearly dry. Not a cupful of water remained, and there was no fish. He found a hidden crevice among the stones through which it had escaped to the adjoining and larger pool, a pool which he could not empty in a night and a day. He had known of the crevice. He could have closed it with a rock at the beginning, and the fish would have been his. Thus he thought and crumpled up and sank down upon the wet earth. At first he cried softly to himself. Then he cried loudly to the pitiless desolation that ringed around him. And for a long time after, he was shaken by great dry sobs. He built a fire and warmed himself by drinking quarts of hot water, and made camp on a rocky ledge in the same fashion he had the night before. The last thing he did was to see that his matches were dry and to wind his watch. The blankets were wet and clammy. His ankle pulsed with pain. But he knew only that he was hungry, and through his restless sleep, he dreamed of feasts and banquets and of food served and spread in all imaginable ways. He awoke chilled and sick. There was no sun. The gray of earth and sky had become deeper, more profound. A raw wind was blowing, and the first flurries of snow were whitening the hilltops. The air about him thickened and grew white while he made a fire and boiled more water. It was wet snow, half rain, and the flakes were large and soggy. At first they melted as soon as they came into contact with the earth, but ever more fell, covering the ground, putting out the fire, spoiling his supply of moss fuel. This was a signal for him to strap on his pack and stumble onward, he knew not where. He was not concerned with the land of little sticks, nor with Bill and the cache under the upturned canoe by the river Dease. He was mastered by the verb to eat. He was hungry mad. He took no heed of the course he pursued, so long as that course led him through the swell bottoms. He felt his way through the wet snow to the watery muskeg berries, and went by feel as he pulled up the rush grass by the roots. But it was tasteless stuff and did not satisfy. He found a weed that tasted sour, and he ate all he could find of it, which was not much, for it was a creeping growth, easily hidden under the several inches of snow. He had no fire that night, nor hot water, and crawled under his blanket to sleep the broken hunger sleep. The snow turned into a cold rain. He awakened many times to feel it falling on his upturned face. Day came, a gray day and no sun. It had ceased raining. The keenness of his hunger had departed. Sensibility, as far as concerned the yearning for food, had been exhausted. There was a dull, heavy ache in his stomach, but it did not bother him so much. He was more rational, and once more he was chiefly interested in the land of Little Sticks and the cache by the River Dees. He ripped a remnant of one of his blankets into strips and bound his bleeding feet. Also, he re-cinched the injured ankle and prepared himself for a day of travel. When he came to his pack, he paused long over the squat moose-hide sack, but in the end, it went with him. The snow had melted under the rain, and only the hilltops showed white. The sun came out, and he succeeded in locating the points of the compass, though he knew now he was lost. Perhaps in his previous day's wanderings he had edged away too far to the left. He now bore off to the right to counteract the possible deviation from his true course. Though the hunger pains were no longer so exquisite, he realized that he was weak. He was compelled to pause often for rest, when he attacked the muskeg berries and rush grass patches. His tongue felt dry and large, as though covered with a fine hairy growth, and it tasted bitter in his mouth. His heart gave him a great deal of trouble. When he had traveled a few minutes, it would begin a remorseless thump, 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 and then leap up and away in a painful flutter of beats that choked him and made him go faint and dizzy. In the middle of the day, he found 2 minnows in a large pool. It was impossible to bail it, but he was calmer now and managed to catch them in his tiny bucket. They were no longer than his little finger, but he was not particularly hungry. The dull ache in his stomach had been growing duller and fainter. It seemed almost that his stomach was dozing. He ate the fish raw, masticating with painstaking care, for the eating was an act of pure reason. While he had no desire to eat, he knew that he must eat to live. In the evening he caught 3 more minnows, eating 2 and saving the 3rd for breakfast. The sun had dried stray shreds of moss, and he was able to warm himself with hot water. He had not covered more than 10 miles that day, and the next day, traveling whenever his heart permitted him, he covered no more than 5 miles. But his stomach did not give him the slightest uneasiness. It had gone to sleep. He was in a strange country, too, and the caribou were growing more plentiful. Also the wolves. Often their yelps drifted across the desolation, and once he saw 3 of them slinking away before his path. Another night, and in the morning, being more rational, he untied the leather string that fastened the squat moose-hide sack. From its open mouth poured a yellow stream of coarse gold dust and nuggets. He roughly divided the gold in halves, caching each half on a prominent ledge, wrapped in a piece of blanket, and returning the other half to the sack. He also began to use strips of the one remaining blanket for his feet. He still clung to his gun, for there were cartridges in that cache by the River Dees. This was a day of fog, and this day hunger awoke in him again. He was very weak and was afflicted with a giddiness which at times blinded him. It was no uncommon thing now for him to stumble and fall, and stumbling once he fell squarely into a ptarmigan nest. There were 4 newly hatched chicks a day old, little specks of pulsating life no more than a mouthful, and he ate them ravenously, thrusting them alive into his mouth and crunching them like eggshells between his teeth. The mother ptarmigan beat about him with great outcry. He used his gun as a club with which to knock her over, but she dodged out of reach. He threw stones at her, and with one chance shot broke a wing. Then she fluttered away running, trailing the broken wing with him in pursuit. The little chicks had no more than whetted his appetite. He hopped and bobbed clumsily along on his injured ankle, throwing stones and screaming hoarsely at times. At other times, hopping and bobbing silently along, picking himself up grimly and patiently when he fell, or rubbing his eyes with his hand when the giddiness threatened to overpower him. The chase led him across swampy ground in the bottom of the valley, and he came upon footprints in the soggy moss. They were not his own, he could see that. They must be Bill's, but he could not stop, for the mother ptarmigan was running on. He would catch her first, then he would return and investigate. He exhausted the mother ptarmigan, but he exhausted himself. She lay panting on her side. He lay panting on his side a dozen feet away, unable to crawl to her. And as he recovered, she recovered, fluttering out of reach as his hungry hand went out to her. Night settled down and she escaped. He stumbled from weakness and pitched head foremost on his face, cutting his cheek, his pack upon his back. He did not move for a long while. Then he rolled over on his side, wound his watch, and lay there until morning. Another day of fog. Half of his last blanket had gone into foot wrappings. He failed to pick up Bill's trail. It did not matter. His hunger was driving him too compellingly, only he wondered if Bill too were lost. By midday, the irk of his pack became too oppressive. Again, he divided the gold, this time merely spilling half of it onto the ground. In the afternoon, he threw the rest of it away, there remaining to him only the half blanket, the tin bucket, and the rifle. An hallucination began to trouble him. He felt confident that one cartridge remained to him. It was in the chamber of the rifle, and he had overlooked it. On the other hand, he knew all the time that the chamber was empty, but the hallucination persisted. He fought it off for hours, then threw his rifle open and was confronted with emptiness. The disappointment was as bitter as though he had really expected to find the cartridge. He plodded on for half an hour when the hallucination arose again. Again he fought it, and still it persisted, till for very relief he opened the rifle to unconvince himself. At times his mind wandered farther afield, and he plodded on, a mere automaton, strange conceits and whimsicalities gnawing at his brain like worms. But these excursions out of the real were of brief duration. Forever the pangs of the hunger bite called him back. He was jerked back abruptly once from such an excursion by a sight that caused him nearly to faint. He reeled and swayed, doddering like a drunken man to keep from falling. Before him stood a horse. He could not believe his eyes. A thick mist was in them, intershot with sparkling points of light. He rubbed his eyes savagely to clear his vision, and beheld not a horse, but a great brown bear. The animal was studying him with bellicose curiosity. The man had brought his gun halfway to his shoulder before he realized. He lowered it and drew his hunting knife from his beaded sheath at his hip. Before him was meat and life. He ran his thumb along the edge of his knife. It was sharp. The point was sharp. He would fling himself upon the bear and kill it. But his heart began its warning thump, thump, thump. Then followed the wild upward leap and tattoo of flutters, the pressing as of an iron band about his forehead, the creeping of the dizziness into his brain. His desperate courage was evicted by a great surge of fear. In his weakness, what if the animal attacked him? He drew himself up to his most imposing stature, gripping the knife and staring hard at the bear. The bear advanced clumsily a couple of steps, reared up and gave vent to a tentative growl. If the man ran, he would run after him. But the man did not run. He was animated now with the courage of fear. He too growled savagely, terribly, voicing the fear that is to life germane and that lies twisted about life's deepest roots. The bear edged away to one side, growling menacingly, himself appalled by this mysterious creature that appeared upright and unafraid. But the man did not move. He stood like a statue till the danger was past, when he yielded to a fit of trembling and sank down into the wet moss. He pulled himself together and went on, afraid now in a new way. It was not the fear that he should die passively from lack of food, but that he should be destroyed violently before he had a chance to save himself. There were the wolves. Back and forth across the desolation drifted their howls, weaving the very air into a fabric of menace that was so tangible that he found himself, arms in the air, pressing it back from him as it might be the walls of a wind-blown tent. Now and again the wolves in packs of 2 and 3 crossed his path, but they sheered clear of him. They were not in sufficient numbers, and besides they were hunting the caribou, which did not battle, while this strange creature that walked erect might scratch and bite. In the late afternoon he came upon scattered bones where the wolves had made a kill. The debris had been a caribou calf an hour before, squawking and running and very much alive. He contemplated the bones, clean picked and polished, pink with the cell life in them which had not yet died. Could it possibly be that he might be that ere the day was done? Such was life, eh? A vain and fleeting thing. It was only life that pained. There was no hurt in death. To die was to sleep. It meant cessation, rest. Then why was he not content to die? But he did not moralize long. He was squatting in the moss, a bone in his mouth, sucking at the shreds of life that still dyed it faintly pink. The sweet meaty taste, thin and elusive almost as a memory, maddened him. He closed his jaws on the bones and crunched. Sometimes it was the bone that broke, sometimes his teeth. Then he crushed the bones between rocks, pounded them to a pulp and swallowed them. He pounded his fingers too in his haste, and yet found a moment in which to feel surprise at the fact that his fingers did not hurt much when caught under the descending rock. Then came frightful days of snow and rain. He did not know when he made camp, when he broke camp. He traveled in the night as much as in the day. He rested whenever he fell, crawled on whenever the dying life in him flickered up and burned less dimly. He, as a man, no longer strove. It was the life in him, unwilling to die, that drove him on. He did not suffer. His nerves had become blunted, numb, while his mind was filled with weird visions and delicious dreams. But ever he sucked and chewed on the crushed bones of the caribou calf, the least remnants of which he had gathered up and carried with him. He crossed no more hills or divides, but automatically followed a large stream which flowed through a wide and shallow valley. He did not see this stream nor this valley. He saw nothing save visions. Soul and body walked or crawled side by side, yet apart. So slender was the thread that bound them. He awoke in his right mind, lying on his back on a rocky ledge. The sun was shining bright and warm. Afar off he heard the squawking of caribou calves. He was aware of vague memories of rain and wind and snow. But whether he had been beaten by the storm for 2 days or 2 weeks he did not know. For some time he lay without movement, the genial sunshine pouring upon him and saturating his miserable body with its warmth. A fine day, he thought. Perhaps he could manage to locate himself. By a painful effort he rolled over on his side. Below him flowed a wide and sluggish river. Its unfamiliarity puzzled him. Slowly he followed it with his eyes, winding in wide sweeps among the bleak bare hills, bleaker and barer and lower lying than any hills he had yet encountered. Slowly, deliberately, without excitement or more than the most casual interest, he followed the course of the strange stream toward the skyline, and saw it emptying into a bright and shining sea. He was still unexcited. Most unusual, he thought. A vision or a mirage. More likely a vision. A trick of his disordered mind. He was confirmed in this by the sight of a ship lying at anchor in the midst of the shining sea. He closed his eyes for a while, then opened them. Strange how the vision persisted, yet not strange. He knew there were no seas or ships in the heart of the barren lands, just as he had known there was no cartridge in the rifle. He heard a snuffle behind him, a half-choking gasp or cough. Very slowly, because of his exceeding weakness and stiffness, he rolled over on his other side. He could see nothing near at hand, but he waited patiently. Again came the snuffle and cough, and outlined between two jagged rocks not a score of feet away, he made out the gray head of a wolf. The sharp ears were not pricked so sharply as he had seen them on other wolves. The eyes were bleared and bloodshot. The head seemed to droop limply and forlornly. The animal blinked continually in the sunshine. It seemed sick. As he looked, it snuffled and coughed again. This, at least, was real, he thought, and turned on the other side so that he might see the reality of the world which had been veiled from him before the vision. But the sea still shone in the distance, and the ship was still plainly discernible. Was it reality after all? He closed his eyes for a long while and thought, and then it came to him. He had been making his way north by east, away from the Dees Divide and into the Coppermine Valley. This wide and sluggish river was the Coppermine. That shining sea was the Arctic Ocean. That ship was a whaler, strayed east, far east from the mouth of the Mackenzie, and it was lying at anchor in Coronation Gulf. He remembered the Hudson Bay Company chart he had seen long ago, and it was all clear and reasonable to him. He sat up and turned his attention to immediate affairs. He had worn through the blanket wrappings, and his feet were shapeless lumps of raw meat. His last blanket was gone. Rifle and knife were both missing. He had lost his hat somewhere with the bunch of matches in the band, but the matches against his chest were safe and dry inside the tobacco pouch and oil paper. He looked at his watch. It marked 11 o'clock and was still running. Evidently he had kept it wound. He was calm and collected. Though extremely weak, he had no sensation of pain. He was not hungry. The thought of food was not even pleasant to him, and whatever he did was done by his reason alone. He ripped off his pant legs to the knees and bound them about his feet. Somehow he had succeeded in retaining the tin bucket. He would have some hot water before he began what he foresaw was to be a terrible journey to the ship. His movements were slow. He shook as with a palsy. When he started to collect dry moss, he found he could not rise to his feet. He tried again and again, then contented himself with crawling about on hands and knees. Once he crawled near the sick wolf. The animal dragged itself reluctantly out of its way, licking its chops with a tongue which seemed hardly to have the strength to curl. The man noticed that the tongue was not the customary healthy red. It was a yellowish brown and seemed coated with a rough and half-dry mucus. After he had drunk a quart of hot water, the man found he was able to stand and even to walk as well as a dying man might be supposed to walk. Every minute or so he was compelled to rest. His steps were feeble and uncertain, just as the wolves that trailed him were feeble and uncertain. And that night, when the shining sea was blotted out by blackness, he knew he was nearer to it by more than 4 miles. Throughout the night he heard the cough of the sick wolf, and now and then the squawking of the caribou calves. There was life all around him, but it was strong life, very much alive and well, and he knew the sick wolf clung to the sick man's trail in the hope that the man would die first. In the morning, on opening his eyes, he beheld it regarding him with a wistful and hungry stare. It stood crouched with its tail between its legs like a miserable and woe-begone dog. It shivered in the chill morning wind, and grinned dispiritedly when the man spoke to it in a voice that achieved no more than a hoarse whisper. The sun rose brightly, and all morning the man tottered and fell toward the ship on the shining sea. The weather was perfect. It was the brief Indian summer of the high latitudes. It might last a week. Tomorrow or next day it might be gone. In the afternoon the man came upon a trail. It was of another man who did not walk, but who dragged himself on all fours. The man thought it might be Bill, but he thought in a dull, uninterested way. He had no curiosity. In fact, sensation and emotion had left him. He was no longer susceptible to pain. Stomach and nerves had gone to sleep, yet the life that was in him drove him on. He was very weary, but it refused to die. It was because it refused to die that he still ate muskeg berries and minnows, drank his hot water, and kept a wary eye on the sick wolf. He followed the trail of the other man who dragged himself along and soon came to the end of it. A few fresh-picked bones where the soggy moss was marked by the footpads of many wolves. He saw a squat moose-hide sack, mate to his own, which had been torn by sharp teeth. He picked it up, though its weight was almost too much for his feeble fingers. Bill had carried it to the last. Ha ha! He would have had the laugh on Bill. He would survive and carry it to the ship in the shining sea. His mirth was hoarse and ghastly, like a raven's croak, and the sick wolf joined him, howling lugubriously. The man ceased suddenly. How could he have the laugh on Bill if that were Bill? If those bones, so pinky white and clean, were Bill? He turned away. Well, Bill had deserted him. But he would not take the gold, nor would he suck Bill's bones. Bill would have, though, had it been the other way around, he mused as he staggered on. He came to a pool of water. Stooping over in quest of minnows, he jerked his head back as though he had been stung. He had caught sight of his reflected face. So horrible was it that sensibility awoke long enough to be shocked. There were 3 minnows in the pool, which was too large to drain, and after several ineffectual attempts to catch them in the tin bucket, he forbore. He was afraid because of his great weakness that he might fall in and drown. It was for this reason that he did not trust himself to the river astride one of the many drift logs which lined its sand pits. That day he decreased the distance between him and the ship by 3 miles, the next day by 2. For he was crawling now as Bill had crawled, and the end of the 5th day found the ship still 7 miles away, and him unable to make even a mile a day. Still the Indian summer held on, and he continued to crawl and faint, turn and turn about, and ever the sick wolf coughed and wheezed at his heels. His knees had become raw meat like his feet, and though he patted them with the shirt from his back, it was a red track he left behind him on the moss and stones. Once glancing back, he saw the wolf licking hungrily at his bleeding trail, and he saw sharply what his own end might be, unless he could get the wolf. Then began as grim a tragedy of existence as was ever played. A sick man that crawled, a sick wolf that limped. 2 creatures dragging their dying carcasses across the desolation and hunting each other's lives. Had it been a well wolf, it would have not mattered so much to the man. But the thought of going to feed the maw of that loathsome and all but dead thing was repugnant to him. He was finicky. His mind had begun to wander again and to be perplexed by hallucinations, while his lucid intervals grew rarer and shorter. He was awakened once from a faint by a wheeze close in his ear. The wolf leaped lamely back, losing its footing and falling in its weakness. It was ludicrous, but he was not amused, nor was he even afraid. He was too far gone for that. But his mind was for the moment clear, and he lay and considered. The ship was no more than 4 miles away. He could see it quite distinctly when he rubbed the mist out of his eyes, and he could see the white sail of the small boat cutting the water of the shining sea. But he could never crawl those 4 miles. He knew that, and was very calm in the knowledge. He knew that he could not crawl half a mile, and yet he wanted to live. It was unreasonable that he should die after all he had undergone. Fate asked too much of him, and dying he declined to die. It was stark madness perhaps, but in the very grip of death, he defied death and refused to die. He closed his eyes and composed himself with infinite precaution. He steeled himself to keep above the suffocating languor that lapped like a rising tide through all the wells of his being. It was very like a sea, this deadly languor, that rose and drowned his consciousness bit by bit. Sometimes he was all but submerged, swimming through oblivion with a faltering stroke, and again, by some strange alchemy of his soul, he would find another shred of will and strike out more strongly. Without movement, he lay on his back, and he could hear, slowly drawing near and nearer, the wheezing intake and output of the sick wolf's breath. It drew closer, ever closer, through an infinitude of time, and he did not move. It was at his ear. The harsh, dry tongue grated like sandpaper against his cheek. His hands shot out, or at least he willed them to shoot out. The fingers were curved like talons, but they closed on empty air. Swiftness and certitude required strength, and the man had not this strength. The patience of the wolf was terrible. The man's patience was no less terrible. For half a day he lay motionless, fighting off unconsciousness and waiting for the thing that was to feed upon him and upon which he wished to feed. Sometimes the languid sea rose over him and he dreamed long dreams, but ever through it all, waking and dreaming, he waited for the wheezing breath and the harsh caress of the tongue. He did not hear the breath, and he slipped slowly from some dream to the feel of the tongue along his hand. He waited. The fangs pressed softly. The pressure increased. The wolf was exerting its last strength in an effort to sink its teeth in the food for which it had waited so long. But the man had waited long, and the lacerated hand closed on the jaw. Slowly, while the wolf struggled feebly and the hand clutched feebly, the other hand crept across to a grip. 5 minutes later, the whole weight of the man's body was on top of the wolf. The hands had not sufficient strength to choke the wolf, but the face of the man was pressed close to the throat of the wolf, and the mouth of the man was full of hair. At the end of half an hour, the man was aware of a warm trickle in his throat. It was not pleasant. It was like molten lead being forced into his stomach, and it was forced by his will alone. Later, the man rolled over on his back and slept. There were some members of a scientific expedition on the whale ship Bedford. From the deck they remarked a strange figure on the shore. It was moving down the beach toward the water. Being scientific men, they climbed into the whaleboat alongside and went ashore to see, and they saw something that was alive but was hardly a man. He was blind, unconscious. He squirmed along the ground like some monstrous worm. Most of his efforts were ineffectual, but he was persistent, and he writhed and twisted and went ahead perhaps a score of feet an hour. While crewmen lifted the emaciated man onto a raft, two curious researchers stepped away to follow the man's path away from the beach and onto the stony terrain. A short walk out into the desolate landscape revealed a trail of what might have been blood. Further on, as the evidence was more pronounced, the researchers became sure of it. Finally, they came upon a motionless gray lump amongst the rocks and moss, and it was clear the source of the blood. But when the men approached the gray-furred figure and turned it over, their curiosity turned to horror. Emaciated as the man on the shore, eyes sunken and mouth agape, a great gash torn from the neck. It seemed like the work of a solitary wild animal, a wolf perhaps, but wolves were not solitary, and it was not lost on any of the men as they trekked back to the Bedford that, solitary or not, whatever animal responsible, even in the starving and desolate landscape, had chosen not to eat the man, or at least not very much of him. Three weeks afterward, the man lay in a bunk on the whale-ship Bedford, and with tears streaming down his wasted cheeks told who he was and what he had undergone. He babbled incoherently of his mother, of sunny Southern California, and a home among the orange groves and flowers. The days were not many after that when he sat at table with the scientific men and ship's officers. He gloated over the spectacle of so much food, watching it anxiously as it went into the mouths of others. With the disappearance of each mouthful, an expression of deep regret came into his eyes. He was quite sane, yet he hated those men at mealtime. He was haunted by a fear that the food would not last. He inquired of the cook, the cabin boy, the captain, concerning the food stores. They reassured him countless times, but he could not believe them, and pried cunningly about the lazarette to see with his own eyes. The officers of the Bedford kept close watch on the man. He would recover in time, the scientific men agreed, although his memories of his ordeal would seemingly not. When asked, he had no memory of any wolves, no details on his companion Bill, who he insisted he last saw in the hills. And if he had come across the dead man on his way to the shore, he could not remember that either, and he never would again. Not even as the Bedford's anchor rumbled down in San Francisco Bay.
Chilling tales for dark nights.